We don't need to be able to say we've got the best versions of the best grimoires. We need to say, well, this is what I did with it. It's less about what is the proper sigil for Angel Raphael and who do you want to heal and what do you wish to heal them of and what good does that do for the world that they've been healed of that.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. Today, we are excited to talk about the faculty of Abrac with author, artist, jeweler, goldsmith, and experienced ceremonial magician, John R. King IV. John has spent decades dedicated to the study of demonology and ceremonial magic, and in addition to many other books and writings, John is also the author of the influential tome entitled Imperial Arts, which relates his first-hand experiences in the evocation and exorcism of demons from the Lemegetans Goetia over many years. If this is your first time hearing John, I'd also encourage you to check out Glitch Bottle episode number 31, where John shares about the fundamentals of Solomonic Magic and talks about the magical renaissance, which is how and why magicians use engagements with spirits for noble ends. John's latest tome is entitled The Faculty of Abrac, which is a more than 450-page tour de force detailing John's comprehensive review of the ceremonies of Solomonic magic for the invocation and evocation of spirits celestial, terrestrial, and infernal. In the pages of The Faculty of Abrac, John urges the reader and the magician to sincerely embody the office of Solomon, and how to do that. He breaks through the many mental traps, armchairing, and overanalyzing that prevents magicians from actually achieving progress in the art and science. John also shares an incredibly comprehensive analysis and explanation of the deeper meaning and interconnection between the 72 spirits of the Lemegetans Goetia. John shares why too much effort is applied by modern students of magic to symbols and the meaning of symbols, and far too little attention is paid to the role of the magician and the objectives chosen for the work. Do spirit registers really matter that much? What about merging science and magic? Aliens, interdimensionality? Why is it so important to reestablish and maintain covenants with the divine to successfully do the work? All of these subjects are explored in The Faculty of Abrac from a magician with decades of experience under his belt. John touches on all of these topics in our chat. He also answers your Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions. Thank you so much for those. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome back John R. King. John R. King, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Pleasure is certainly mine, John, and thank you for writing such a wonderful book. And I guess the best question to open this up is, you say on your blog, Imperial Arts, which again I definitely recommend listeners check out, that this new book, John, The Faculty of Abrac, quote, will likely annoy and confuse occult experts, appearing as 500 pages of rambling blasphemy and unsolicited opinions. I do not apologize, you say, unquote. What was the genesis of writing The Faculty of Abrac?
I've had lots of people over time ask me for when volume 2 and 3 are coming out and give me more information or want to talk more. And then we had, of course, a year of not doing anything else really with the pandemic, and it was Rufus Opus who said, hey, you need to get to publishing something. So I did, and this is it.
There might be listeners out there, John, who know that you have years of experience under your belt. They're looking at this new book, and they might wonder about the title, The Faculty of Abrac, and it's only mentioned once in the text. It's on page 349. Can you elaborate for readers who haven't picked up their copy yet, and listeners, what is the significance of the title? What did you want readers to take away with The Faculty of Abrac?
Well, first off, that it's very obscure. It's one of those words that doesn't occur very many places and really has only one context. And the only context that it has is to be spoken to the spirit as a way of dominating the spirits when they're evoked before the circle. In terms of literature. It really only appears in the Peter Diabano stuff, and it appears in the Lemegeton Grimoire Magic and in Mormonism. It was Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph Smith's mother, who's apologizing for her son, saying essentially that he was not doing magic rituals when other people seem to think that he was. And she mentions that he is not going around trying to win the faculty of Abrac. That was such an interesting phrase to see it there, because we know that it really only comes out of the Heptameron and the other similar types of literature. So where did she come across this word if he wasn't actually involved in that sort of thing in some way? It's not the kind of word that she would just conjure up. It's the kind of thing that you have to kind of have read a few books in order to get. So when I was looking at this obscure phrase at the end of the conjurations, what does this mean? What are you saying to the spirit? Is this to be spoken, or is this a phrase that's just included in the text? And so after looking over the entire thing, it's not mentioned in the book, but that's essentially why it's there. It's because it's this very obscure, specific piece of jargon that ultimately refers to the idea that if the magician is not upholding his end of the covenant, then the spirit doesn't have to uphold its end of the covenant either. So then the process of conjuring spirits becomes less a process of finding the right words to plug into the equation, and more a process of having a mutual arrangement of some kind between the magician and the spirit. And this faculty of Abrac is loosely defined as the ability or power to call upon spirits or command spirits.
Broadly speaking, John, what are some of the main ideas that you are challenging that perhaps some occult experts might consider sacrosanct, or they might hold dear? What are some of the big things that you're really challenging?
Well, first off, the idea that there are things that are sacrosanct. That proposition in general is really the biggest aspect of it, because when you start to get into something like the mystery religions of any kind, or anything that spawned from them, and you decide, well, now I know what's the truth and I'm going to take the mystery out of it, then it loses a lot of its appeal, and you have to check yourself and be able to understand that maybe you don't understand things as well as you thought you did. So I attempted to include as much as possible of ideas and concepts that I feel I've demonstrated are related to the topic of magic, but that aren't usually associated with magic. Everything from Mormons to the reptile aliens to the ancient world to the future, just all kinds of things that are associated with the practice of magic, but are not necessarily part of anybody's specific set of doctrines. So someone looking to have a fortification of their existing argument for how something works or what it is, they're likely not to find it in this book, but instead they're going to find a challenge of whatever it is that they currently think that they know. That's really what I mean by that, is that if you have an idea that you're an occult expert, you know what you're talking about, it's going to be very hard to read this book cover to cover and come away with the feeling that you actually know what you're talking about.
You mentioned too, John, that, quote, either the lore of spirits will expand to include the much larger worldview now available, or the advance of knowledge will be halted in favor of a more comfortable mythology, unquote. Can you explain what you mean by that in terms of you really encourage magicians to look forward as opposed to being obsessed about reconstructing old texts?
So let's say that we step back in time. Instead of projecting to the future, it's easier to see the present from the lens of the past. If you were to go back 100, 200, 300 years and you're to start talking to people about, let's say, heaven, and you ask people about angels, heaven, generally speaking, even today, some traditional, like you go to Greek Orthodox and they talk about their angels and they're blonde men, muscle-bound blonde guys in togas, and that's what really in their world, the spirit world, is about. And I think that a lot of people still kind of have leftovers of these older belief systems where they really think that this is literally the way that the universe works. It's a bunch of white guys upstairs in Cloudland directing things on a map table or something. And I really don't believe that the modern world is on board with that. There's a diversity of opinions about spirituality. There's a diverse projections as to where the spiritual future of humanity will lead us and where it's come from. And we've been able as a society to kind of accommodate these. Most people could see, for example, that Hindus and Muslims and other people of faiths are all kind of getting on certain things that they agree upon. And then we mark out our differences, and we no longer, generally speaking, stab each other over that kind of stuff. It's important to have recognized that has changed, that the modern world has come to a different plateau of understanding about things that just 100 years ago were very concrete definitions of how everything worked and exactly what everything is. So in the future, whatever perspective that we have now, if it's not going to be able to be updated to match new information that comes in, whether it's scientific discoveries or just different strategies that the planet decides to undertake, then these spirits, demons, gods, God, all of that will be forgotten. It'll be lost. It won't be relevant to us anymore. So either we're going to update them to match our definitions, to match the new reality as we know it, or we're going to be clinging to something that we know is just a fantasy that was come up with hundreds of years ago by somebody who didn't really understand what he was doing.
To play devil's advocate here, John, I know that there might be listeners out there who say, I hear what John King is saying. We have to adapt. We have to evolve. Well, I am on a quest to connect the grimoire tradition and the spirits therein to being extra-dimensional beings, or I am on a quest to take the modern science that, as John says, we need to look forward, and I want to take modern cutting-edge biological theories and apply that to the spirits. In your book, The Faculty of Abrac, you kind of slice through these common theories that people have for explaining things like alien theory or multidimensional being theory. Can you just elaborate on that in terms of helping people to kind of escape those potential mental traps?
Sure. There's not anything that's part of magic that's really concrete. All of the different symbols and things that we use, they're all in the world of symbols. They're not really something that is definite in the same terms as you could say, dogs exist, and these are different species of dogs. And the idea that there's species of spirits or whatever is probably not going to last very long. But it's the idea of moving onward to, say, science or biological things or any of that. Well, good luck, because usually when people try to represent magic as physics, the whole chaos magic thing, they love this idea of the math and physics of magic. But when you look at the rituals and the programs that they do, they look the same as anything out of Aleister Crowley or Golden Dawn or any of that kind of stuff, where they're grimoire based. You have your quarter calls and symbols that are drawn, and basically all of the same ritualistic or technical elements. They've just been transposed with different names, or instead of one set of deities, you've now got 3 or 4 sets of deities thrown into essentially the same ritual. So someone who would say, I've updated my paradigm, I'm now working in the modern system, it's not really much more modern. It's just a slightly less obviously mythological set of ideas.
To that point, John, to illustrate this, you do something that I love in the book, which is you encourage magicians or people who are studying magic or who want to sincerely practice it, and you encourage them to step back and apprehend reality as it really is, but also challenge them to apprehend reality at different levels. And one of the fascinating ways that you do this is you take something that so many people are familiar with, the human thumbnail, and you use the human thumbnail as an example, a teaching tool for magicians to apprehend reality at different levels. Can you just give listeners who haven't picked up the book yet some of the broad strokes behind the thumbnail?
So what's not in the book about the thumbnail is that the thumbnail itself has been used by magical teachers for thousands of years to explain some of the deeper mysteries. We've got the Tibetans who would have the yak butter, and they were supposed to be able to take their thumbnail and cast hallucinations of whatever they're teaching onto the sky, some kind of hypnosis or whatever. There's the thumb stuff from the grimoires, scraping off the thumbnail from the scryer, and just the thumb, because it's attached to everybody, it makes a really good object lesson if you can pull something out of it. And so what I intended to say is this is something that you can look at, and you look at your thumb, and you get closer and closer in, and it seems to get more mysterious. You get down to the electron microscope level, and it's like, wow, look at all of this stuff that's on my thumb. You get down to the chemistry level, and it's this world of electrical forces, and you get to the atomic level, you're as far from one atom as the asteroids are from us. It would be like you couldn't even see them. We're a realm where motion and time and everything just completely doesn't matter anymore. And then you can go even further than that, and you get into these very abstract worlds that only really the physicists get into, and you're able to see all of that every single time you're looking at your thumb or anything else. So even though it seems like an ordinary thing, all of the mysteries of the universe that you might want to find, they're all still there. You're looking at them. Every time you look at your thumb, you're seeing the mysteries. You just don't know that that's what you're looking at. So any different part of matter has all of this wonderful stuff packed into it, and it looks to you maybe like dirt or a thing or just whatever it is that you might be looking at in physical reality. The physical reality has so much to it that we don't see. The idea of spirits, magic, and the higher dimensions of what's possible in life, they're also there in your ordinary circumstances, just the same as all of this weird stuff exists in all of your thumb or regular matter. I bring up in this very long introduction, it's kind of an overlong introduction, really trying to tell people that this is not a book about interpreting older scripts of magic. It's not about study of any kind. I could really hardly imagine that anyone could read my book and actually learn anything. It's supposed to be about looking at different perspectives, finding things that you had not considered, and breaking down things that you believe very strongly in that maybe you shouldn't, or that you don't have any belief in that maybe you should give some credence to.
You mentioned regardless of which scientific theory is being considered at any given time, and for people who really want to fix science or marry science and magic 100%, you say, quote, "The existence of a level of reality which is exempt from the forces governing everything else is practically beyond dispute," unquote. Can you share a little bit about this, especially for people out there who think that their will, for example, their kind of overarching will or drive in this life can somehow be linked to materiality alone?
Okay, so and this is discussed also in my other book called The 5 Lectures on Demonology. It's the last part of the Occult Arts ebook. If they're looking at that, it's pretty easy to get into. It's the first chapter. I even think it's up on the free preview if they want to look through this concept of mine. But the bottom line is that our brains are where our thoughts happen. And the things that happen in our brains are electrochemical in nature, that everything that's going on up there is electrochemical. And so it's really just basic chemistry and reactions. And we all know the way that reactions go. You drop sodium into water and it explodes, but it doesn't do that on its own. It has to have the water. So if our brains are just a series of chemical reactions, then my decision to wiggle my thumb or to do anything at all, my exertion of volition, it would just be a reaction of some kind. But there's no known chemical reaction going on in the brain that makes you do those things. You might have something that make you feel like dancing or itching or something like that. There's these very strong prompts, but ultimately the decision or the point at which you exert your will is not the product of any kind of chemical reaction in the brain. Nothing that has happened produces you deciding. It might encourage you to want to do something. You feel like you're hungry. Your body is sending chemical signals that make you hungry, but it's up to you to actually decide to get up and go make a sandwich. That's kind of where I'm saying that the point of interface, this will that we have, that it is a spiritual creature that does not partake in spiritual reality. I do not believe that spirits, whether the human spirit or angels or demons or any of that, have physical presence in the way that we do, that the world of the spirit is entirely exempt from the physical universe altogether. I think if you read the first chapter of Isaiah, it'd probably give you an idea that ultimately the entire physical universe is going to be destroyed, undone. Like I think Hindus believe something similar, that the idea is that eventually all of physical reality will be undone, and yet we remain. And we as individuals and intelligent beings remain, and the only person who has any idea that this is going on is God. that ultimately we all have a spiritual existence where in that existence it's just us and God. No one else gets to get involved in that or to interfere in those decisions, really. That, rather than any kind of astral power or power of concentration or any kind of physical event that occurs, is the kind of spirit that I'm talking about.
That actually goes to a kind of another devil's advocate question, because I can hear some listeners out there who might be saying, John King, I know John King, he's a grimoire traditionalist. He always advocates approaching the spirits on their own terms and doing things by the book. And yet, in this new book, The Faculty of Abrac, you mention that so many magicians are looking backward instead of forward, and there might be a risk of fetishizing old books and grimoires in order to look the part. So can you kind of share with that devil's advocate question, John, that really it is important not to look backwards, and yet you can still approach the spirits on their own terms?
Absolutely. I think that really what I'm addressing there is people who think that you're going to be much better off if you find the correct sigil, the correct prayer, the correct whatever it is that you're supposed to have, and getting the original sources and all of that. And rather than looking backward to find the original sources, which I still am fascinated with all of that. I've not abandoned looking up origins and where everything comes from and all of that. But I don't think it's strictly necessary, or that's where we're going to see advances. If we want, as a general body of magicians, to see where we're going to go with this, we need to, I think, as we talked about last time, just not being in the business of producing more literature. That's not what this is really about. We don't need to be able to say we've got the best versions of the best grimoires. We need to say, well, this is what I did with it. It's less about what is the proper sigil for Angel Raphael, and who do you want to heal, and what do you wish to heal them of, and what good does that do for the world that they're then healed of that. And that those questions are ultimately a lot more important than whether or not you've got the seal upside down because you had the wrong edition of Agrippa.
That is such a great point. And that leads to something that I believe you mentioned in the last podcast, talking about John Dee, about, people looking forward and using magic as a technology. You say in this book, The Faculty of Abrac, that ancient peoples who first built civilizations, quote, were in their day the wizards. They were not looking for arcane and ancient lore. They wanted cutting-edge science and technology, better medicines, and a better understanding of the universe, unquote. So can you just elaborate on that you can still approach the spirits in a grimoire fashion, but you're not obsessed with the past. You're doing it forward thinking.
If you look at a trend or a fad, it'll last a couple of years. A certain style of clothing might last a couple of decades. Political factions, again, they're generational. And then you look at maybe the more stable things like systems of government. Usually last a few hundred years. Really, you've got a system of government lasts one orbit of Pluto. If we want to just bring it into astrology, that's basically how long a system of government will last in the world. And then you've got systems of religion that last maybe slightly longer, depending on whether or not you want to qualify different phases of religious difference. Buddhism, Christianity, they all went through very different phases of their thing. But the one thing that's remained consistent is that magicians from the unremembered prehistoric past have looked at the stars and said, this is how I have been able to interpret all of reality from looking at the stars. And they began with basic astronomy, looking at the sun, the different stars, when they rise, when they set. And a lot of those symbols have been used really up until modern times for how we understand what the stars are. The frickin' scorpion, it looks like a scorpion. It looked like a scorpion 5,000 years ago. It still kind of looks like a scorpion. We still think of it that way. And although scientists now are looking at different aspects of what the stars mean, it's still the means whereby we interpret reality. If you ask an astrophysicist about how the universe works, they're the people on the front lines of telling us, well, I've looked at dark matter, black holes, and all of these physics theories, they're all backed up by astronomy. So the magicians, the people who said, we're looking upward and forgetting about all of this stuff down here, they've been doing that since people have been able to communicate. And that really hasn't changed. But all of the rest of religion and all the rest of that stuff, that has. So the magicians throughout all of this have been the ones that said, we are the foundations of human knowledge and culture. When the people who know how to do things were given their push to go and do them, generally speaking, you had somebody who said, I know how the whole system works, telling them. So this magician, or this astronomer, way back in days of Zoroaster, before that, he said, I'm having a hard time seeing the stars. I need you guys to build me something about 30 feet tall so that I can look up above it, or maybe 70 feet tall, or however tall you can build it. And then somebody said, well, every time we stack the rocks that high, they fall over. Someone had to invent the architecture to get that to hold up. Then you had to invent labor and organization to get all the people to get the bricks from wherever they were to wherever you want to put them. And then you have to have this whole organization of society that builds from there upward, just so that one guy could get a better view of looking upwards at things and get a clear view of it. So not only does it produce knowledge of the stars, really very little of that, but it produced a lot of other things on the ground to support it. Look at the Apollo program. People say, oh, why do we send people into space for Apollo program? Why do we send them to Mars? Look at the amount of technology that goes into producing things like that. You can't just pop them on a bottle rocket and send them up. There's a lot that goes into it. And even when you have billions of dollars and all this work to do it, the rocket can still blow up. So we're still working on that. And this future thinking or forward thinking, dynamic thinking, whatever you want to call it, that's all, if you're looking at the developers of that stuff and who put it together, you don't find scientists, you don't usually find priests, you find weirdos. You find people who said, I'm going to do what other people tell me I shouldn't do. I'm going to look in an obscure place, and I'm going to practice this weird either alchemy, which ended up becoming calculus, or they're doing some other kind of esoteric thing that then gives them whatever spark of illumination that they require to do something much bigger and different than just better astrology. It's something beyond what just the stars alone produce.
You say, quote, it is irrelevant which arrangements fit most conveniently with any preferred philosophical system, which demon king dwells where, or whether heaven is subdivided according to income, unquote, which I love. Can you kind of share with those listeners out there who say, okay, I get what John's saying, big picture thinking, something overrides it, but if I don't understand the hierarchy of spirits and I get something wrong, well, that'll mess up the whole system. What would you say to people like that?
And that's really one of the reasons why, in my early work at least, I'm going as much by the book as possible, because I'm not really sure what I'm doing, and I have to go by the book just so that I can find out. But the book is a guidebook. It's not holy writ. It's not something that if the book happens to not say what I need it to say, that I'm not going to find that out. I really think if somebody is looking at any kind of occult or esoteric system and they think, well, I don't really need this or that aspect of it, maybe you do. Try it out the way it says it's supposed to be tried out first. Figure it out the best that you can and go with it. There's, what's it in Matthew where he says, if you ask for bread, you don't get a stone. If you ask for a fish, you don't get a snake. If you're really attempting to work with whatever powers of the universe that you believe in, and you believe that they're at all responsive to your call to them, then getting at least part of it right ought to be more or less enough to get you going. And if you start realizing, well, I need to add more to this or do less of that, or maybe this is just fluff, then go with that too. Be informed by your experiences and then work beyond them.
I think the question might come naturally, okay, then how can I, as a magician, look forward? How can I incorporate cutting-edge science and technology? And to that point in the book, you say, John, quote, despite what chaos magicians claim, the world has not yet developed a semi-coherent system of occult practice which incorporates much of the scientific advance from the last 5 centuries. And instead, you say, another path is to explore the older works on their own terms, draw the pentacles, recite the prayers, invoke the spirits, and bind evil demons in the name of God. Can you share a little bit about this, the model that you propose compared to, say, the chaos science model?
I really love the chaos science model. I really love the concept of it. It's this idea of having a meta paradigm or something that's a universal system of magic that only incorporates reality as your only symbol system. And this is a great idea, but then again, when I said earlier, you see it in practice, it falls apart. You have somebody who holds his hands up while wearing a monkish looking robe and intoning the name and sigil for Planck's constant or something. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just ritualizing some of these terms. It doesn't connect to, for example, Planck's constant in any meaningful way. If you have a system that actually is able to interface with quantum effects in some way, that's great. But so far, it looks like people spinning around, saying things, drawing things in the air, doing all of the same things that ritual magicians do. So why bother to then neuter the magical parts of the ritual? Because really, what's the strong part of the ritual? Is it the sigil or the name, or is it the deep cultural connection that something like Michael Archangel might have for people? It's a much stronger draw than how you spell the name. It means more, and it attaches to more. And people drop those things and then pick up these new concepts that even the people who think of these physics theories, they don't really understand them. You ask them, they have no idea. They're like, look, this is a paper, I'm doing the best I can. The university level, they're the same way. This is their theories. So we're going to take things that are just their theories and plug them into things which are also poorly understood, and the end result is mud. So I think it's ultimately better for people that if they want to invoke these powers, to invoke them for what they find them as. If you find it as a spell that requires you to use a hog poop and a chant, then use the hog poop and a chant and see where that gets you. Because how do you know what it's supposed to be updated as? Just try it out, see what you get, and then work from there. And as far as going forward with it, and not just in terms of the symbols that people use, but kinds of things that people want to do with it. Like I said, you find who wants to do what with it. You want to accomplish things, desire things that you can't get. Do you want world peace? Great, that's a great idea. Conjure it. Do you want to do something more for yourself? That's great, do that. And then when you find, well, what I need is spiritual reconciliation with my family, or I need to have a better career that's not demeaning or whatever, and then you look through the lists of, say, angels and demons, you're going to see things that resonate with the things you want. It's not just, ooh, this one looks cool and he has a cool sigil and a cool name. It's, I want this for myself, and I see that the office of this spirit is associated with that, so I'm going to use this spirit and this name and this seal as my means of getting the thing that I know I have no realistic means of producing on my own.
Another thing that you tackle, John, in the Faculty of Abrac is lodges and magical orders. And you mentioned that, quote, there is no sect, cult, or esoteric order on this planet that can provide the keys to becoming the sort of person one truly aspires to be, and no magical order in the present time can claim to teach miraculous powers with any credibility, unquote. So for those listeners and readers out there who say, oh, well, maybe a magical order will 100% give me all the answers, what would you share with them?
But first, I'd say you've got to ask a few of the people who have been long-term members of these orders. Go to some of the people who have really been thoroughly involved in it and may not have the wild eyes and, really big talk about it, but who've just been a part of it, and you ask them what they get. And they've always said, look, this is something that it's cool. It lets me meet the people I want to meet. It lets me kind of organize my practice around something. It gives you a social environment. And that's great. If you're approaching it as that, you get a lodge out of it, you get some people, you get some kind of a participation more than what you get on your own. But if you're looking to be taught something special, something really secret, they haven't got any more answers than your average bookseller. Just go to the bookstore, get the stuff. The secrets, the rituals of most of these orders are either published or the same stuff is published elsewhere. You're not going to go from I know nothing to now I've got the power. It's something even they're going to tell you. I don't know any order that's going to sell it to you as if you're not going to cook up your own thing anyway. If you want to succeed, it's going to have to be on you. It's kind of like saying, I like to use playing a musical instrument as a thing. You can get a great teacher playing guitar and teach you how to play anything. doesn't mean that you're going to be able to play that without a lot of practice. It doesn't happen. That's kind of what I mean, that these orders, they might be cool for socializing, but they have a reputation as being really sanctuaries of the adept, and that they're not. A lot of them are very self-serving. They're great at promoting themselves, and I look at, like, what do they do? What have they done? Do they have a hospital? Do they have a school? Have they helped anybody? Have they done anything other than advertise their presence and claim people's dues? I don't know. And again, I'd see the people, and their argument is always, well, it's a cool thing to participate in. We have fun with it. We meet people. It's a good way to organize. I agree with that. But if you're looking at it from a magical development point of view, it's not going to be any more useful than a music teacher is for someone learning to play an instrument.
I'm sure we both know people who are a part of magical orders or lodges who are very accomplished, or who, hearing this, might say, well, we do, excellent group rituals, and this really has helped me. But what you're saying, John, is even though some of these orders, may be beneficial, the benefit always 100% has to come from an internal drive, an internal quest for meaning, for growth, for development. Because without that individual drive, it doesn't matter whether you are part of an order, or it doesn't matter if you are a quote-unquote, solo practitioner. If you don't have that, it's going to be impossible or very, very difficult to progress on any path.
Right. I remember one guy, I really am a fan of his, and I remember hearing of him going through one of the OTO lodges, and it was very difficult for him to get the people in his lodge on board with the kind of work that he wanted to do. The lodge ended up being more of a stumbling block and an obstacle in his path rather than something that put him where he wanted to be. It wasn't the vehicle that he wanted. I don't know if he ever got around to just saying, forget these lodge people, I'm going to do it on my own, but that probably would have been a better approach. The lodge and the idea of growing in the lodge and becoming a bigger member and a more well-recognized whatever, that then takes on the importance that whatever you really wanted would have had. It becomes kind of like a prize that you get instead of the thing that you really wanted. Consolation prize, I guess. So yeah, I do agree that the work is going to have to come from you. Because the lodges generally do involve a lot of your personal time and get you involved with people, if you don't really have a good reason to get involved with that, don't sweat it that you're not actually involved with it.
To that point, John, you spend a lot of time in the book talking about that individual quest for meaning and that individual drive. And you talk about how magicians can embody the office of Solomon and really what Solomon represents. And especially in this age that we're in, John, of polarization, of this side versus that side, of you need to pick a side, you need to represent one position over the other, you talk about balance in the faculty of Abrac. You say, quote, "Magic offers solutions that religion scorns and science cannot attempt," unquote. Can you share a little bit more about this balance, about how the figure of Solomon and therefore the modern magician can kind of walk between the worlds?
The scientists and the priests, they are all bound up in limits as to what they can say. The scientist can only work with what he can show you, what he can prove. The priest can only really work with what his religion teaches. Whereas the magician is free to make some new ideas and test them out, work with them as if they might work, they might not. The magician can attempt practical solutions to things that maybe you don't know that they'll work. And that's not just experimental. Maybe it's just something where you say, well, this is what we're going to do. I'm trying to come up with a really good example on this that might work. We just talked individually about the American Transcendental Movement and the Transcendentalist literature. We could go back and forth on that. But this is an idea that's connected, is that without the transcendental philosophies of late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, the American psyche would not have had the fortitude to go into World War I. We wouldn't have had the sense to establish national parks. We wouldn't have had a lot of the things that visionary spirit produced. And the visionary spirit of seeing, I not only have an idea of what American destiny might be, but we're going to make that happen through a variety of things. We're going to make America an awesome thing, something like has never been done before or whatever. That was the idea that they had. And I'm not saying that they were necessarily ceremonial magicians that were conjuring for this. It's just that this idea of the magician having a vision that's not necessarily something you can prove. No one could prove that America needed to have this advanced moral position or whatever. And it's also not something that's specifically prescribed by anybody's doctrine. But you can say, this is what I want, this is my will, and I will execute it. I will attempt it, and I will do whatever I've got to do to get that. In terms of the character of Solomon, we have Solomon who's he's a young kid. Everybody knows the story of his having a dream. He gets his wisdom because he refuses wealth and all the material gains and things. And his biggest problem is that everyone hates him. He hates his country. His country is kind of like modern Israel. It's beset by enemies on all sides. He wants to build up a temple. He's got these grand designs. And yet the central thing of what you need to build a temple is tools and work, and all of the other nations say, look, every time you guys build something, you get all these metal tools, and then the metal tools get turned into spears and swords and weapons, and so whenever you're done building something, then you go and kill people, and we don't like that. Solomon was diplomatic about the issue, and rather than saying, no, we're going to do it anyway, too bad, we're going to kill you later, he said, well, let's negotiate this. Let's be diplomatic and figure out a little bit of what you guys want and a little bit of what I want, and we'll meet somewhere on it. And that's kind of where the legend of Solomon goes. Every point of Solomon is a compromise that doesn't compromise his faith or his intentions of what he wants to accomplish. The only thing that he compromises is the means.
And John, you touched on this in the last podcast, but that exact point is so important because there might be people out there who pick up the Lemegeton's Goetia for the first time who say, well, no, this is about, I order the spirits to do X and they will bring me Y. And this is how Solomon had it. And you're saying, no. In fact, if there is a covenant made, these are mutually agreed upon terms within the ritual itself, not between you and the spirit, but between you and the spirit in front of God, in front of the Creator, the divinity. And so is that kind of fair to just say that Solomon, by walking that path, used power, but in a diplomatic way, in a way of mutually agreed upon terms?
Right. Solomon in Islam is considered a prophet. He is a model for a certain kind of office or character, a diplomatic ruler. He's, the magical calendar, it's got the seals of the 8 fathers, and you've got, the different patriarchs from the Bible. And if you look at those as different models for what kind of a person you could be, that's still a holy figure of some kind. And there's this attempt to find out what are the different models that you could be. Solomon is just one of those character models that you can undertake. And it's a person who has total power, really, over whatever it is that he wants to do. And he doesn't just exercise it harshly. He judiciously, prudently, and peacefully, most importantly, executes this will of his people that's laid on him. It's not really his goal either. It's a goal that's passed to him not just from his father, King David, but from everybody from Moses forward has laid this task on Solomon to complete it. It's not really within his office to be able to reject it either. You can't just say, forget that, I won't deal with that. He's got to do something with it. And so Solomon represents the position of humankind as ruler of the earth. There's really nothing that opposes us. There's really not a whole lot that's in the way of humankind doing what we want to do in the world, but we're still responsible for it. And Solomon, if nothing else, is a figure of responsibility, not just for yourself, but for how you deal with other people and their intentions, which might not be aligned to you.
That last point, too, really bears on something that you dedicate many, many pages on in the Faculty of Abrac, which is embodying that responsibility of Solomon, and also what it means when you are inside the circle and you are actually engaging with spirits. And you say, and I really, really like this definition, you say, quote, John, magic is a language of the imagination and intuition rather than strictly observed facts. And for that reason, you say, it is woven into the world of spirits who are themselves symbolic creatures rather than the world of hard sciences, unquote. Can you kind of elaborate on this for listeners who might be wondering, okay, how are the spirits symbolic? And how does the symbolism relate on, for example, your thumbnail example earlier?
So, yeah, we spend a lot of time in the book on the hierarchy of spirits. It's a main element of grimoire literature is to have a hierarchy of spirits. And so it really deserves some going over in that. And this idea of all of the spirits, whether you consider them to be elemental or celestial or terrestrial or infernal or however it is that you want to classify spirits, really it's a way of relating to phenomena in your life. If you have what we talked about earlier with Raphael and healing, the healing is the subject. What goes on with the person is the subject. Raphael, you don't really ever get to know who is this, what is it, what kind of existence does he have, does he go home and tell his wife about this guy who called him up to heal his whatever. You don't know any of that, but you do know I appeal to this character in this format, and I'm expecting a kind of result out of that. So your entire interaction from start to finish is almost like a prayer. It's a process of interacting with the universe, saying, these are the circumstances as I would like them to be, and I'm doing this set of ritualistic actions to make them what I want. And then the idea of evoking spirits is that that process is able to be attenuated to being able to be talked about as if it were a person, being able to edit your desire to say, oh, you're not going to get that, or you're going to have to do something different. You don't just get a vague notion of that, but you have something that's comprehensible to you, whether as a person or as a creature, as in some way comprehensible to you, that then edits that desire and says, nope, not going to happen that way, or it's got to happen this way, or you've got to do this, or it says, behold, here it is, you're healed. And one way or another, we don't know what those creatures are. That we can't find out. We can't figure out any of that. That's anyone who tells you that they know exactly what it is, they're lying because they don't. The spirits, whatever form that they take, they are just something that we relate to through our words and pictures and other ideas about them. But they tie in that point of will, of I wish to do something, and then the observed effect that we're expecting.
You mentioned that a lot of these descriptions of spirits and their offices or what they might look like or what they might appear as, that's done as part of that symbolism, part of that interface. For example, I believe in the book you mentioned that if you want to contact an earth elemental spirit, for example, it's much easier or a little bit more malleable to have that interface represented as a gnome-like spirit, for example, than just the raw element of the earth. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
So I don't know exactly how much of this I want to really get into here because it'd probably take a bit of time, but a long time ago in California, I really like working with digging up treasure. This is my thing. I love working with the earth and spirits in the earth and the idea of using magic to look for treasure. I've got right over there, I've got this big old crystal that I dug up, and the way that I dug this up is I drew the symbol on the ground and called out these earth elementals to bring me my treasure, and I'd want to find the biggest crystal I've ever dug up right here, and lo and behold, I jammed my pick into the ground, and it was about maybe 3 or 4 inches below the soil, and I actually chipped the tip off of this really nice crystal and broke the bottom half off, which was just enormous. It was right there. And granted, it's in a spot where it's, I guess, likely enough to have crystals, but it's, the finding of the specific thing right where I wanted it, right when I wanted it. Another time going, again, looking for treasure. I wanted to go into a mountain. I had this huge, maybe 12-foot across shelf of stone on the mountainside, and I believe that this mountain contains my gold, which I've been obsessively trying to get into this mountain full of gold for years now. I think we talked about it last time. Nothing happened. I didn't get my gold when I tried to break in through this thing. I figured, well, I'm going to do the same basic thing. I'm going to draw a thing on the ground. I'm going to call out the gnomes and see what they do. Is there going to be this elven door that opens up in the mountains? No, it didn't happen. About a week later, went back to the same place. The entire shelf, that entire side of the mountain, the whole thing was gone. It was actually not gone. It was going down the river as I was looking. The entire slab of maybe 100 feet by 100 feet up completely collapsed into the river. Just that part. And it wasn't like there was a giant landslide anywhere else, just on that one part where I was standing, there's no longer a shelf there. And so this idea of the symbolic reality versus the real reality is still the rocks. But getting some interaction with these rocks, I don't just address, hey, rocks, I'd really wish there was a nice crystal under my feet. It's calling the gnomes to bring up my treasure. I'm not just knocking on the wall and saying open sesame. I'm expecting that there's a discerning force of some kind, a spirit, a will, a being of intelligence who's able to understand what I'm looking for and then deciding whether or not I'm going to be given that, and then to either execute it or deny it or to do something else. The spirit, in that sense, I have no idea. I couldn't even tell you today. What is a gnome? Is it a little person that lives in the earth? Is it a spirit? Is it an angel? Couldn't tell you. But I know that using magical spells to call upon gnomes to get treasure, it does work. Sometimes, at least. And it's worth pursuing just for that. And we're not at a point yet at which we can say, we don't need the gnomes, we're just going to knock on the rock. We're just not there yet.
Wow, that is such a fascinating story and really ties into several of the themes that you've written about extensively. And you also touch on the faculty of Abrac, which is absolutely that symbol interface and the drive behind that interface. The thing that upholds everything, the scaffolding, is faith and faith in God. We discussed this last time. That might be one of the most overlooked points of magic. People want to jump right to the circles and the sword and the demon names. Can you share, John, why is faith in the divine, in the creator, why is that the foundation of Solomonic magic? And why couldn't it be anything else but that?
Sure. So the symbols and things are just the symbols, but ultimately you're dealing with spirits which have, just assuming, they have the same kind of individuality that we have. That it's an intelligence. That you, regardless of the meat suit, you're an intelligent being who has its own thoughts and its own volition in the universe, and so do they. And so regardless of any of our circumstances, there has to be some kind of mutual authority over everybody. You're not going to be able to make a deal of any kind unless you have some kind of common ground in it. And people want to say, I bind the spirits on my own, I burn their seals or whatever. Generally speaking, at least in traditional societies, grimoires, all of the folk magic stuff too, there's higher powers that are called upon to do that. There's some power that the magician is also subject to, even if it's just the sun and the moon. There's a higher power that both the magician and the spirit both are subject to. And, I like to talk about the principle of intelligence, aside from this idea of I exist, go back to Descartes and all that. You also have to realize that in that existence, you're not the source and be-all, end-all of existence. You know that you exist in a universe that exists, one way or another. You don't know exactly, even if it's a simulation, you know that it's bigger than you and you didn't make it. And any other intelligent being, spirit, demon, demigod, whatever you want to call them, they recognize that too, or else what kind of an intelligence do they have? There might be gods and goddesses throughout mythological history that claim that they created the universe, and that's part of their mythology. Granted that. But if you're actually communicating with an intelligent being, part of its communication, if it's telling you that it's the be-all, end-all of everything and, brought up the space dust from the galactic disk and turned it into human beings that then contemplate that, no, it's bigger than all of that. So any of these spirits that we interact with, they are on that plane of spirit, beyond whatever we have materially. They are on the same page. They also relate to their version of God. Also in Lectures on Demonology, page 77 is mentioned there. And it mentioned in Imperial Arts about, being just dumbstruck by this idea that the spirits, the demons' versions of God is essentially the same as ours. That they all think that their version of God is the same version of God that we're working with. And how weird is that? Not that they're in league with the devil or whatever, but more like what the Muslims say, where they say that these are 72 princes of the Ifrit, and that they are simply those who recognize that they have a choice of salvation and said, nah, no thanks. Because if you can't choose to reject salvation, you don't have any free will at all. If you can't say no, it's not really a choice. And I mean, you've got to really be able to say no. And, it's worth thinking of, because in the conjurations, at least in the Lemegeton conjuration, you say to the spirit in sending it off, let there be peace ever continued between thee and me. Well, these spirits, you're telling them they're set over for the fires of hell. At which point are you going to break from them? Or at which point are you going to say, no, that's for me too? It's something worth considering. Other things in the grimoires, that you're also giving the permissions to understand what you want. You say, complete this insofar as it serves my interest. Well, how's it going to know what your interest is if you're not permitting it to see all of what you want and all of your desires, and to be open then to all of the temptations that could produce? So, you have to have an authority over that's more than just what you have in your head and more than just what you can write down on paper. It's got to be something sublime. And so the authority that the magician has is knowing that, just like them, we are also subject to the ultimate judgments.
And that, John, leads us to the largest individual section of the book. Speaking of holding the spirits accountable and the importance of oaths before God, because you dedicate exactly 200 pages of the book to an exploration of these 72 spirits of the Goetia, specifically highlighting very important information from your deep experience, from your decades of experience about the spirit sigils, history, lore, symbolic representation, and also different pathways for a magician to engage with the meanings behind these entities. So can you elaborate on this section of the book, this very significant section, and what are the big things that readers should definitely keep in mind when they first start to read this section and when they go through it?
So the 72 spirits of the Brazen Vessel of Solomon, more than any other thing in occultism other than maybe the 12 signs of astrology, it's probably the most popular thing in the modern world. I don't think that you could come up with any other topic in practical occultism that has nearly as much appeal as those specific 72 spirits. Not their versions in some other book, but that particular set. They're the ones. And what I intend, first off, that anybody who's going to contemplate maybe purchasing the book or getting into it is to realize that if you haven't read my book on these spirits, this particular book, The Faculty of Abrac, you don't know what you're talking about. You just don't know. All the seals, the spirits, where they come from, all of that. This is fresh toast, people. You have not heard this stuff before. If you think you have, you haven't. It's new. And it's relevant. It's not just like I've made up a bunch of crap to talk about and ramble on for 200 pages about them. These are things that I think that if you're genuinely interested in what are these spirits and what are they about, and working with them in a practical sense, that this is really just invaluable. You're not going to find anything else like this on the market at all. And, I talked to a number of different people when writing this book about it, and they're all like, oh, yeah, there's a bunch of books like that coming out. No, there's not. There's nothing like this ever. One of the main things that you're going to find is that there's these pictures of the seals with my little doodles on them. And I most intend to reveal to people that what these seals show us is that this is a deliberate catalog of 72. That the seals incorporate numbers, maps, letters, all kinds of specific things. These are not seals placed on them at their binding by God or anything like that. These are little pictograms that somebody a couple of hundred years ago had put together, and the book makes this clear as to how, and for a lot of ways why they would do that, what they're trying to get across. The other main thing that you're going to find is that Every single one of the spirits is already recognized in world mythology to some degree. Some of the entries on that are speculative. I kind of mentioned where that is, but general idea is that these are not demons that exist in demon land. What you're seeing is a strategy for connecting to existing mythological and non-Judaic deities of sorts. Some of them I would say that's a stretch because they're actually in the Bible, but every one of them is recognizable from some other format. So if you ever hear of anybody saying, "Oh, I called King so-and-so," or they don't know what they're talking about. And you have to read the book to figure out why you don't. I'm going to point out two of them in particular just to go with this, give you an idea of what I'm talking about. The first principal spirit. The first spirit in the book altogether is this deity that was really common in the ancient world, the deity, which is actually many deities, named Baal. And the Baal and the Baalim, they're mentioned as probably the biggest pagan deity villain in the entire Bible, because Baal just means Lord, and it was Baal this and Baal that, and whatever it is that they thought was Lord of this or Lord of that, they gave it a name. And the manner of lordship that these deities had is that they rule people's territories, that they set down laws, they gave people not demonic things, they gave them good things. They gave them agriculture, they gave them law, they gave them a sense of national unity. These were the good guy gods for the people who worshiped them. But it's presented here as a demon, or an ifrit, or however you want to see it, an infidel jinn, because ultimately these are all very human-like deities. And they give us the idea that the divine is also like us in some significant way. And that's a very tempting thing to see. You can hardly look at the universe and not want to put in some way or another a human stamp on seeing that. It doesn't matter how devout or divine you are, when you look at the way that the universe behaves, you're going to put a human understanding on that. And if you fall to that temptation, which is a very, very tempting thing, then your entire perspective on what humans are, what humans are going to do, where humans go, what the whole world is for, it's going to be based on false information. You're going to be wrong. The universe does not work for human benefit or for even the benefit of maybe even conscious beings. It has a divine purpose of its own sort that we might not really get to know. So if you go through life with this idea that mankind is God, or that God is equivalent to man, then when something that's beyond man shows up and must be dealt with, you're going to be in a pickle at that point. You're going to be like what all the prophets say happens to those who worship the idols and follow after them. And I'm not talking about bowing down and burning incense in front of an unauthorized spirit deity. I'm talking about just fundamentally falling to a real temptation of believing that the world as you think of it in terms of human terms, that's the way that the world works. Bring up another one, just kind of give you some of the other flavor that's in the book. One of the spirits is named Salos. And I talk a bit about in the book how I believe that this name, the writing of the name Salos, is actually a very well-known African deity by the name of Shango. And Shango is a deity of unchecked masculine aggression. The idea of Shango in his original system is that men are strong and brave, and we can use weapons and tools, and men can do things, and that the world could be run by men. And Shango in the stories finds out that doesn't always work out exactly well. He's got to be cooled down because he goes into a rage. And in Greek terms, he'd be Ares. Is the god of war. He's captured for 30 years in a brazen vessel. And so this is him. His seal shows weapons, the same kind of double-headed axes that you find him depicted with in Western Africa traditions. And, how does this get into a book of demonology? Well, think of what was going on in the 16th, 17th century. It was the Atlantic slave trade. And they had all of these really strong people being captured essentially out of Africa and told, well, you're not going to get to be a noble warrior anymore. Now you have to plow a field. that probably didn't go down very well with a lot of them, and I bet Shango was on the lips of many, many people who got killed for refusing to put up with crap. So that is kind of how this deity gets into the Book of Demons, because for the Christians, Muslims, whoever it was trading the slaves at that time, they believe in this deity, they scream his name, they're super hot for this deity, and he has a place in the world of mythology. But the reality is, the spirit, just as the Yoruba people recognized, unchecked masculine aggression is a temptation that doesn't work. It has a place, it has purpose, but if you allow it to grab you and do more than what you need to do with it, then it becomes a demon. It becomes dangerous. It can destroy the entire world. We've got a point now where one senile old man could press one button and literally destroy the world within about half an hour or less. I don't know, it may be even quicker at this point. And that's something that has come to us after years and years and years of being weak against this temptation to create strength and weapons and aggression as opposed to whatever else we might produce. So if you can get into the way that those are both related, then that gives you an idea of the kinds of approaches that this book is taking to the 72 spirits of Solomon.
That leads to something you just touched on, which is the necessity of responsibility. And by working with spirits that are so powerful, the question naturally arises, how can someone, as a magician just starting out, employ wise personal decisions? How can they have responsibility, especially when you say, quote, a person with limited focus and selfish desires will not succeed in Solomonic magic. In order to truly understand the system, a magician must look outward. So can you share about that, about responsibility and avoiding the temptations, as you say?
The book is set up so that you begin small and get bigger over time. And the first, I've called it the levels, because I like the fantasy role play idea of you have these levels of magic, and I like that idea because the modern audience, I think, will resonate with that better than, say, grades or degrees or anything kind of formal. The idea of using the word level, it lets people know it's meant lightheartedly. But when you begin with this, the first level is all about getting acquainted with the symbol sets, the Proverbs of Solomon, getting a full year of just studying this stuff and getting accustomed to the idea of what are the Proverbs and studying that. And people have, carried the Proverbs off since the Gideons have been giving them off to people. The Proverbs of Solomon are something you can look at. Some of it's really crazy stuff, but some of it's quite practical. And when you read through it, it gives you a sampling of wisdom. And by looking at that sampling of wisdom, the hope is that when they start going on to the next levels of working with actual spirits, that they've at least given some thought to, maybe I should change the way that I want to do it better. Maybe it'd be better to seek out wisdom in my youth rather than treasure in girls. And then when you go on to the next section up the ladder, you're focusing, it's the Almadel, basically replacing church with these spirits. On Sunday morning, you get up and you light your candles and you say your prayers, and then you expect to receive not visions. It's not about creating visions and auditory hallucinations. It's about creating wise ideas, wise understandings. There's a variety, and this all described the different types of things that the different spirits will provide, but ultimately it gives you a different perspective, so that then going on further up the chain, by the time that you get to spirits that have much more practical ambitions attached to them, where it doesn't just say, well, this is for all things Mars related, but specifically this causes this effect. That by the time that you get to the level where you're working with spirits for more practical purposes and really specific things, that you've already got under your belt this guidance from the other spiritual categories of different ways of doing things, better ways of doing things. It's not just, I want this specific thing, but you're moving in a path of becoming a whole variety of things that has its own set of wants attached. People begin, they say, well, I want riches. I just want riches. I want to be rich. That's great that you want riches, But riches are many things to many people. There's a million rich people in America, at least, maybe many more, really, really rich people. And they're all very different in the way that they obtain their riches, the way that they do things. So just saying, well, I want to be rich, you've got to figure out a little bit more of what you want. Do you want to be a good rich guy, or do you want to be an evil rich guy? There's a whole different way of getting that. And being able to communicate, interact with the spirits to figure out what I want to be doing specifically is better than just cherry picking from what you could possibly do.
You also mentioned that they really should become comfortable with exploring ways to make their own tools, their own equipment, their own materia magica. And to illustrate this, you mentioned that for sincere practitioners wanting to practice magic, they must tackle what you call the 4 cardinal cacodemons: mess, danger, expense, and trouble. Can you elaborate on why these 4 are so troublesome from the outset?
From the very beginning, when I first started in jewelry, I noticed all of these things come up. And I call them cacodemons because I want to separate them from the idea of actual demons. These are just characterizations that I make of things that go wrong in a shop environment. When you're trying to make things, there's things that are bad that happen. They're pretty much guaranteed to happen. The mess and danger and trouble and all of that. It's really just a way to categorize the kinds of things that go bad so that you can get a handle on them. And then it's also a way to explain that just in the way that expertise, for example, will banish these demons to some extent, it gives people an idea of what I mean when I'm talking about calling upon the celestial powers to bind the evil spirits, for example. That this idea of binding spirits by the power of something can be understood in terms of keeping control on mess or on trouble. And trouble is when, like, you're involved in a project that's gone poorly already, and then the owner's ex-girlfriend shows up and demands money of him, and you're waiting on him to talk to her so that you can get this sensitive casting done. And just things like that happen that are trouble, and learning ways in which to deal with those, or mess. I've been in so many shops where it was just an absolute pigsty, and figuring out ways in which to minimize that. You learn that, well, I do this, and then the mess demon goes away. So then you start to learn, well, if I do this, that, and the other, then the actual demon is in a similar way bound and kept under my control, so that I no longer have to worry as much about these things that could go wrong. Really, the idea is that by doing the virtuous things, the vicious things become less powerful.
And I believe in our email exchange, you bring up the grimoire of Honorius with this next question, but you mentioned that far too much effort is applied by modern students of magic to symbols and the meanings of symbols, and far too little attention is paid to the role of the magician and something you just touched on, which is the objectives chosen for the work. Can you share, John, a little bit about why is it so important not to get bogged down in symbols and instead focus on the why and the role of the magician?
I think when you're talking about the email about Honorius, the idea is that the Pope has these 7 days of conjurations, and each of the 7 great demons that the Pope is responsible for negotiating with in some sense. He's binding the 7 great devils. So the Pope, at least in the grimoire author, it was probably not the Pope. In their viewpoint, the purpose of the Pope, the role of the Pope, is to be the spiritual intercessor against these, because no one else has the power like the Pope does to bind evil demons. So therefore it should be part of his responsibility to call them up face to face, speak to them, and say, "You suck, I'm going to stop you." And that's part of his job. And that the idea of Solomonic magic, which, bringing the Pope in to do it is just a Christian version of Jewish King Solomon. So the Solomon ruler motif, he's got the position to be authorized to do these things. It's his job as that person who's authorized to control whatever it is that the king controls. He must call up the good spirits and say, guide me, teach me. He must call the evil spirits and say, I'm going to stop you from doing evil. He must do these things, or he's not fulfilling his responsibility as king. Whereas as a person, we see ourselves as our own little miniature monarchies, each one of us. If we're not doing the things that are incumbent upon us to do, then we're not doing what we need to be doing. So if you have a talent for doing something, you don't do it. What good is it? What good is it to have that talent? If you have an intention or an idea about the way that things should be, just sitting around complaining about it's no good. You have a responsibility to use the physical and intellectual capacity that you have to do something with that, to speak to the right people, to perform the right actions, whatever it is that is required to get what you think must be done. And if you don't think that it must be done, then find what you do think must be done. But there's nobody who's just, you say the lump on a log. Nobody that's their job. Everybody who wants to can find what they're really for, what they're good at, and then apply that some way. And I think that it's kind of our responsibility as people to be doing something like that. It's incumbent on us. Otherwise, we're just animals. And to that point, it's not really mentioned in the book too much, but the idea of the animal man, really, and how being not necessarily a magician, but taking on these responsibilities is what elevates us above that. Man is like nothing else. We're maybe slightly genetically different from the chimpanzees or the hominids or whatever came before us, but there is nothing at all like man. The whales don't build, the ants build, but they don't have literature. The bees do things, but they're not us. There is nothing in the world like the difference between the prosimian and the hominid is very small. The difference between the monkey and the ape, not too much. Monkeys run around in trees, apes run around on the forest floor. Ultimately, they play with their poop. They don't do a whole lot different from each other. But man, we make rockets and computers and medicines, and we do things on a scale that nothing else in this world even comes close to doing. And that can't possibly just be a permission for us to go and live like we're a gorilla. I'd love to just put a leaf on my head and hang out in the rain and eat fruits and vegetables all day. That'd be great. It'd be fun. But because I am a human being, I am by nature qualified to do more. And I believe that it's morally incumbent on us to do more with that.
One of the inverse points that you make in the book is if you don't do what you're supposed to do, either by holding it back or if you transgress in some way, then the spirits effectively say, well, why should I uphold my end of the bargain? And a really great way that you make this point is in the section on forgiveness and cleansing and repentance. Can you kind of elaborate on that? Because you say that repentance, when someone is starting off on the magical path, or ideally every single day, asking for forgiveness is the revitalization of a covenant that has been broken. It's not just about, feeling bad about something. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. So the idea of repentance, and I have to make clear here because there's so much religious baggage attached to this word. If you've done your 51st Psalm and your purification rites and putting on all of the gear, at some point you've probably done this purification ritual where you call upon, the 51st Psalm to say, "Purge me with hyssop." And the idea of what the hyssop is kind of important in the system. It's not just a particular herb. It's that this herb was what was used to purify the people in the temple ceremonies and tabernacle ceremonies. The people would say, I've done something wrong. You bring your blood sacrifice to the priest. He kills the sacrifice. He throws it on essentially a giant barbecue grill called the Altar of Holocausts. It's in the outer court of the temple. It's considered one of the minor miracles of the Temple of Solomon that it didn't stink, even though it was an abattoir. And that's just one of the things that they were able to make happen. And then once you've done your blood sacrifice, you'd go into the inner parts, and there'd be a priest who then blesses you with the incense, and he takes a sprig of hyssop dips it in the blood of the sacrifice, and then throws the blood onto the veil of the tabernacle, which is the most precious possession of the entire nation of Israel. So he's taking this dirty, nasty, fetid animal blood and throwing it on the most beautiful thing that the entire nation has, so that the smallest stain of sin from anyone is a sin that affects the entire nation. And then you get this purification, and then you go out and you're fortified. And that was the idea of hyssop, and why people invoke hyssop in this ritual. It's because you have to be willing to recognize where you've gone wrong, and furthermore be willing to recognize that you could do better and move on from there. It doesn't have to be that you've violated somebody else's arbitrary spiritual compact where they've decided these are the rules and then you've somehow violated them and now you feel guilty about it. That's an entirely different thing. That's a guilt trip. What I'm talking about is being able to recognize where you've actually done wrong for what you want to do. So let's say that you want to be wealthy, and that's the main thing that people seem to want from magic. I'm going to say I chase a lot of treasure myself. I want to be rich. Well, we all know that there's a certain way that you could hustle. And then there's a certain way that you could do the opposite of hustling, whether to become a heroin addict or whatever else that pretty much defeats the whole idea of hustle. And there comes a time where you've got to recognize, well, this thing that I'm doing is counterproductive to the thing that I'm wanting. And if you can't recognize where the things that you're doing are taking you away from the things that you're wanting, you're not likely to get there. That's what I mean by repentance, is to say, well, maybe all this heroin is keeping me from becoming a billionaire or whatever, just to find out the thing that you need to not do and then to willingly admit that you're doing that and make amends.
That touches on something else, John, which is in the faculty of Abrac, one of the things that I really enjoy, and I think the listeners will really enjoy too, is you approach things in different architectural structures effectively. So for example, for those listeners out there who are very familiar with alchemy and alchemical transformations, and which ties into that element of repentance and growing in the magical art and science, you wonderfully share this wisdom in a section of the book called the 12 Alchemical Transformations. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about why you specifically chose to employ this alchemical parallel alongside this expose and tying it into Solomonic magic?
In the Lemegeton, there are 22 essential tools that you're going to need one way or another. And it's just too much of a little coincidence to ignore the fact that that ties in pretty closely with the idea of the Hebrew letters and the Hebrew alphabet in general, at least as it's understood in modern sense. And so the idea was that you've got these sections of 3, 7, and 12 that it divides up into. You get down to where you got these 12 different divisions of things and the cycle of doing things. And everybody's familiar with the zodiac. It's got to a point where it's almost overlooked because it's so common to see that, and there's really not that much written in terms of, alchemy and connections between alchemical ideas and grimoires. And the initial section of the book that talks about alchemy is interpreting it as the practical tradition, that through alchemy people began to understand that this magic and all of the esotericism was much more than just spirituality, that it had a practical component. It was expected to do something. And alchemy is not just a series of one-off processes, but a series of cyclical processes that repeats and refines and continually renews itself over and over again. So I thought, well, it'd be nice to present this in a format that not only tells about these 12 tools and kind of how they're used, but also to align that with the idea of alchemy. There's no actual connection between anybody's book of alchemy and the Lemegeton and the tools in it. I just decided, well, this works. I can explain both in the same set. So it's kind of arbitrary. It's not like these are the 12 alchemical transformations that this produced. It's just a way of describing it. I do think, though, it's a way of presenting all of the different work as if it's part of a complete cycle or set of practices that revolves around itself and that doesn't just go in one direction, but that continually revives itself over and over as you learn more and grow more and start to do more with it.
And in that section, you talk about the crown, the crystal, the coal, and it seems like all of these different sections, these kind of different terms, are designed to specifically engage a magical practitioner, not just inside the circle, but this could be done at any time.
Right, so just an example of each. By the crown, I'm defining as magic that, I guess what the chaos magicians would call high magic, where you're not really using any tools or anything like that. This is maybe somewhere in the ceremonies you've said, look, when I do this, then this will happen, or you just say simply, I wish to be skilled at something, or I wish to be wealthy, or whatever it is that you wish. This by the crown is when you have yourself in such a position that you are able to work with the desires that you have in the circumstances that you're in without the need for a lot of extra stuff. By the crystal, we'd be talking about things like talismans, spells, things that have gear that you need, an obscure piece of gear maybe like a crystal. And then by the coal is when you've got to get everything together because you're kind of uncertain about what your position is. You're going into something new that you're not familiar with, or something that is maybe needing to be undone that's already been done. Anything like that, you're going to be on much less certain ground, and so it's going to involve this huge amount of either ritual or bric-a-brac or different words and names and all of that stuff. If you have to pull out all the stops, then you're working by the coal. You're working against something that you didn't really want to deal with. Even if it's just that I can't get the spirits to do what I want them to do, so I'm going to do a more elaborate ritual to get that to happen. And it's always easier, better, I guess, more ideal to be working by the crown, but ultimately everybody ends up going one of the three at some point.
And what I enjoy too, John, to that point, is when you tie everything together, and you do this by refuting in the faculty of Abrac one of the most, I think, common misperceptions that at least new people have, which is spirits in a ritualistic setting just do one-off requests. That's it. I want A, I request A, I will get A. But you elaborate on something you call the chains of connection in magic, where you say, quote, the magician must learn to anticipate where people act under the bondage of the spirits, a thing that becomes clear only over time. This will eventually, you say, allow the magician to properly address these issues through the spirits and thereby become able to use the ceremonies to relieve the spiritual illnesses of others, unquote. This struck me as just an incredibly refreshing and powerful reminder. Can you share a little bit more about the chains of connection?
Okay, so earlier I mentioned the spirit Salos is the spirit of martial aggression, and really his power is to make women love a person, to be macho, to be handsome and cool. Working with the spirit, you are guaranteed to be brought into connection with aggressive males. If you are working with some of the spirits that have feminine powers, you're going to be brought into connection with women who have maybe whatever kind of approach you're looking at, whether it's a sentimentality or eroticism or whatever, that you're going to get people that are drawn to you that are on the same vibe. And you're going to end up working with these same powers. You don't just work from a distance where you say, okay, make this happen. You're going to get involved in stuff that's probably going to last a long time. Some of these spirits, like, I've been working with some of the same spirits for years on just ongoing kind of projects, and it's always amazing to me the kind of things that happen seem to be in that spirit's domain. And it's not just random looking stuff, but wow, that's so very close to whatever it was that I was looking at. Over time, I've got this idea that if you're just trying to call the spirit and say, look, I just want this one thing, that had really better be your whole true will. And I don't mean that in like some Aleister Crowley sense, so maybe I do, but I mean, you really have to say, if the thing is the Robert Johnson thing, I want to play this guitar, I want the spirit to show me how to play this guitar, and I want it to be what it is. You don't have to get a relationship with the Crossroad King to get to that point. You just have to really know what you want and really be into it. And even though I still feel like that whole story is more like bringing up African American folk music to the fore. But aside from that, the idea is that to really just say, I just want this, now go away, it has to be something of such profound value to you that you're able to articulate it that closely. Like I said earlier, if you say, I want to be wealthy, you don't really know what you mean, because you probably don't really know what wealth is. You might want what somebody else has, which is a very different thing from wanting to be wealthy. You might not even know what being wealthy means. You might really just not want to have to deal with a jerk boss, or not want to have to live in a cockroach apartment or something like that. And you might be able to find those things in very different ways than the ways that you think you want them. It's something that if you're going to conjure the spirits, you're probably going to be dealing with them on a more in-depth basis than just call it up and then send it home.
You know, John, when you talk about that disconnect between what people expect versus what they want versus what actually happens in ritual, one of the key areas that you really delve into, too, is you tackle head-on this kind of expectation on physical manifestation of a spirit. This is obviously one of the most debated topics in a lot of online forums, at least, but could you elaborate on why it's important to remember that spirits, as you say, quote, appeal instead directly to the neural interface of the magician, in which sensory input becomes processed into sounds and images? The conjuration, you say, offers permission for the spirit to enter into the mind of its conjurer in its declarations that it must appear in a form that is clear, affable, and acting in the magician's interests, unquote.
Right. So if I'm looking at a cup of coffee, smelling the coffee, tasting the coffee, any kind of sensory experience that I'm having, that is nerves that have picked up a signal. It's passed through my whole neural process into my brain. I'm not a neuroscientist. I have really very little idea of how that all works. But the picture that I have in my thoughts of this coffee is a mock-up. It's not the coffee itself. I'm not directly experiencing that. I'm experiencing an image of it that's produced in my head, a picture of it. It's sound, sight, smell, all of that. You know, I've gone back and forth over this for years as to whether anything is actually there, because it seems to be, but really, what do you deal with? And some of these things are invisible. Once I thought one ate a bug on the floor, which I'm still fairly certain it did. And there's other things that really seem to be fairly physical type effects. But ultimately, after giving it a lot of practical consideration, in the circle kind of stuff, I'm at a point now where I'm pretty certain that what we're dealing with, it's just a mock-up like the coffee. You don't say, well, this coffee, it might seem like it's hot, but really that's just my neurons giving me this impression of it being hot, and it's not actually. No, if you drink hot coffee, it's hot. And the same with the spirits. If you're going to have this experience, just because it's something that the spirit is saying, okay, I'm going to take whatever neuron that you have and tweak it so that you see me, then that's just like having that coffee there. It's just a tweak of the neuron. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's actually something standing there. I think that that's an important thing, that people are expecting, that they don't just want it to look like it's something there. They want there to be some kind of assurance that there actually is a thing there. Just intellectually, I have no model for how a process like that would occur, and I don't have any real indication aside from things like the bug, moving of incense around, and other paranormal type stuff. I don't have any other kind of indication that there's, physically speaking, anything with you in the room when you're conjuring demons. I think that to look at it in a bigger, broader sense, really what you're doing is you are showing up before the pearly gates. That the magician is standing before the seat of judgment with the spirit there, as if you're in a courtroom. And that triangle is less of, a portal to hell, and more like a witness stand, that you've called that spirit to stand, and you're making a mock-up of what's going to happen on the day of judgment. And that you conjuring the spirit to make your life become a certain thing, that you're telling that spirit, I am going to be in charge of this. You and your temptations, you making me want to think or behave in a certain way, you are no longer doing that to me. Instead, I'm going to be the one who is in charge of my spiritual destiny. And to think of it in terms of, conjuring yourself into the seat of judgment is a very different level of interpretation than to say, well, I'm calling this thing into my basement or my living room or whatever. And I think that people can be forgiven maybe for looking at it that way. But after years and years of practical experiment on it, I have no reason to believe that there's anything that I could kick or stab or throw something at over there in the corner. And I don't think that that really should be what people are looking for in terms of magic. That's one of the biggest reasons why I arranged the system of levels as I did, where you go from the Almadel, where it's simply light, smell, intuition. Then you go to a crystal where you have slightly more defined type of interaction. And then you go to these other formats that just get more and more complicated, because you don't want to go, okay, I've never done any of this before, but I got all of this stuff. Now I'm going to try and conjure demons. That's probably not the right way of approaching it. It's got to have some kind of a background that builds you up to that.
And I would love your take on this, John, because I was just chatting with Frater Ashton Chassan last week about this as well, which is bathing in the strangeness. If you go into a ritual, for example, with an exact expectation of what's going to happen, and if exactly what you expect, especially if it's the first time you're doing this, happens exactly as you envisioned it, did you really accomplish something? Did you really successfully accomplish a ritual, or was it more of a fantasy? Can you talk about that, about embracing strangeness, embracing the unknown?
Yeah, I think that that's really where the magician is not just playing with things that are obscure, but things that are unknown. You must be in virgin territory, or else you're just playing in somebody else's pool. You got to really find some aspect of this art that appeals to you as your own, and just go for that. When I began with this, the experiments back in Memphis, my very first successful manifestation of the spirit was absolutely terrifying. I literally jumped, and I'm surprised I didn't actually jump out of the circle. It wasn't, the manifestation of the spirit was not in front of me. It was over on the side. It was very dark. The purpose that I had in mind was completely inane. My intention was to win a philosophical debate with Mormons. That stuck with me even till today. I mean, that initial move of what I'm going to be doing with this magic stuff is I'm going to be rearranging things related to this Mormon stuff as part of it. I got what I wanted out of it to some extent. Some of it maybe I didn't. But I had no idea what I was dealing with. I thought that I did. What I got was not what I expected. I expected, an old man on a donkey or something. Instead, it was more like, say, a person that was bent like taffy, pulled into a shape, as if their hands, their feet, their face were deformed and made into like a creature, like a 4-footed creature that was not furry, not any kind of definition at all, like a shadow, black and near. I mean, I don't know if you've stood in the 9-foot circle, you know what I'm talking about. It's 4.5 feet from whatever it is that you're conjuring. It's really close and scary and weird, and I got out of it as quickly as I could and then ran inside. And, it took me months before I'd even approach it again. Maybe a year, maybe more. And it was very disconcerting, and I didn't reapproach it for quite a while because of that. And then having after it have my voice controlled and turned into this weird gravelly thing, and I asked for skill in rhetoric. I ended up being able to say anything I wanted, make people believe whatever it was that I said, even if I knew that what I was saying was completely not true. If it was a rhetorical proposition where I was going to argue and say, this is, nobody should have parking tickets ever, that proposition could be argued to a point of totally indisputable, where no one could come up with arguments against whatever it was that I would say, even if it was inane. And I don't think that is, it's something that is inside people to some extent. It's not like words are flashing in front of my face, say this, tell them this. It's something where I could make an argument knowing that it was a bad argument, and other people, for whatever reason, would not be able to argue against it. And that to me seemed like just the weirdest thing, but only when I spoke with this really gravelly voice, just this voice that sounds like Oscar the Grouch. And I couldn't, no matter what I did, it didn't feel like anything. My throat wasn't changed. I didn't feel a hoarseness in my throat. It just came out like that for like 3 days. And I have no explanation for that, but it seemed to work. When I finally did get back into it, the idea was I'm going to test this somewhat scientifically. I called up the spirit that calls earthquakes, and I said, well, I'm going to make an earthquake in this particular place. There was more than 100 earthquakes in that place on a new fault line. And I said, well, that was weird, but even that, I'm still not believing in what I'm doing. I'm going to test it by calling it again and asking for the same thing, another earthquake, bigger, in a specific location, on a specific day, and of a specific magnitude. And all of that was done. And at that point, my ability to say, I don't believe in this stuff, ended. I was in Memphis. I had actually driven from California to Memphis. And when I arrived at my father's workplace, on the commercial appeal front page was an article about the San Simeon 2003 earthquake. And it was like, holy crap, it actually worked. It's really hard for me to say it's all in my head when there's things like that obviously either affect other people's thought processes or that affect things like the earth that has nothing to do with anybody's thought processes.
That reminds me of the often repeated quote that we don't choose our beliefs, that if you bathe in the felt presence of direct experience, you can't really choose what you believe because you've been through it, and therefore you just know at that point. Is that somewhat fair?
I would say I know that it's real and that it works. I can't say that I know how it works or what kind of reality that it has. And that's really mostly what I want to convey in this book, is that as much as you might have experience in magic, and it'd be very hard for a person who's inexperienced in magic to read this book at all. It's really something that it's going to appeal to people who are serious, but it's going to make them look at it and realize how little they actually know about whatever it is that their cherished philosophies are. If you think you have an idea about how all of this stuff works, give it another think, because there's a lot of thought that could be possible that you might not have considered.
One of the listener questions we have for you is a listener question from Sean that ties directly to a point you just brought up, which is, Sean wants to know, how does John deal with fear when spirits arrive?
Yeah, if it's not an engaging emotion in some sense, then it's probably not worth doing. And even just in a normal sense, if you meet a person and it's not something that gives you an emotional reaction of being, oh God, I'm meeting so-and-so today, or, oh, I can't wait to meet them. If you don't have an emotional input, it's not really worth doing. A number of times I've been actually afraid. It's been a few. I thought one of the spirits would eat me. I actually thought that it might eat me. Another of the spirits, it was degrading to a sense where finally I got indignant and I said, look, we're all dirt. We're all space dust. That's the fact that I'm here able to talk to you and to even conceive of these issues means that there must be more to it than just being dirt. And so your proposition to me is not acceptable. And that's the binding of the spirit, and being able to overcome those fears with the spirits and being able to overcome those sense of being affronted or to get through those emotional experiences and then to return to the spirits with that and say, no, you can't intimidate me. You can't make me afraid of this. Or they've threatened to do things to me before. One of them made threats that actually seemed to have made good on over time. And it's like, well, even still, I know that my reaction to that was, no, I'm not going to be afraid of this, even though actually several times it was. One time I thought the spirit was going to set me on fire. I actually thought that I had caught on fire. It was no fire at all. It was just an illusion and things like that. Or noises, distractions, things that are creepy. Generally speaking, though, and I'm with Peter Carroll on this, I've heard his thoughts on this, and that if your encounters with spirits are heavily fear-based, then all you're really doing is psyching yourself up, getting your cortisol going, getting yourself into a frame of mind where you'll believe anything. And that's not the point either. If you're overly afraid of all of this, it's no good. Emotional engagement is good. Being afraid is good. If you're afraid of something because it's standing right there and it looks dark and scary, you're a sane person at that point. If you're not afraid of it, then it's probably BS, or it's something that, or if you're not emotionally engaged in some sense. If you just go, oh yeah, I called a spirit and it's fine, probably not going to get a whole lot out of that. But those few experiences where I was really strongly afflicted by something, those are the ones that tended to have results that panned out a little bit better too. When I stood my ground and was able to say, no, this is how I'm going to respond to this panic or this fear.
That is a really, really good point about what you bring into the ritual and your expectations beforehand. That ties, John, into another listener question for you from Sean, who says, John seems to achieve manifestations of apparitions via magic regularly. What is John doing that ensures such a high success rate in this regard? Other practitioners, Sean says, myself included, usually get voices or some other audible disturbance, but not necessarily visible manifestation, like an apparition.
The main thing that I can say is I really don't know. I don't consider myself in any way special, privileged, whatever. It's just that's what it is. I've given it a lot of thought as to why this stuff works. One of my friends actually did some divinations and conjurings of his own, and he says something to the effect of, the spirits have something nasty planned for me. Maybe. It might be that when I was a child, one of the priests consecrated me to the priesthood. It might be that when I was 15, I wrote all of the sigils of the 72 out in my blood and made a pact that they would answer me whenever I called on them. It might be a whole bunch of things. I don't know. I just don't know. What I really would love to see is when magicians stop looking at it as a means of producing these phantasmagoria stuff and instead say, you know what, I don't really give a care about whether or not it appears to me or gives me a thing, but whether or not only do I get the results, because it's not just about getting the results, it's about being able to tailor those results to what you want. And the whole purpose of having any manifestation of a spirit is to give you a handle that you can change the direction of things. The Red Dragon Grimoire gives you these 10 points where it says, look, I want this. I want you to meet with me at a very convenient hour and immediately lead me to the treasure. And the spirit says, no, I'm going to make you meet at a very inconvenient hour, and you're only going to get a piece of the treasure at a time, and then you've got to give it back to me so that the next guy can get a pile of treasure too. Without that interaction, all you've got is this open-ended demand to give me some treasure, and it goes nowhere. You have to have the spirit be able to inform you of why you're not going to get it that way and how you could get it that way. It's got to change it a bit. You know, the genie shows up and tells Aladdin what you can't get. That's a very critical process, because if you don't know what you're not allowed to get, you're not going to know what you really can get.
That kind of ties in to something that you touch on in the Faculty of Abrac and the figure of Solomon, which is authority. And to that point, John, we have a listener question from Damien saying, quote, John had mentioned in the past how he became, I believe, an ordained deacon in an attempt to garner more spiritual authority over the spirits, to get them to actually carry out his charges properly. Damien's asking, did you, John, notice any significant benefit in this regard? And is there anything else that you've done that can help shed light on this?
So when I was in Las Vegas, I knew a judge who liked my work, was very happy with my work overall. It was a little bit difficult to deal with in some respects. And his proposition to me was that I would create Mormon temple art and generally define Mormon art. There's this guy Freiberg who's done a lot of the Book of Mormon pictures. There's a lot of what you'd call iconic Mormon art, but most of it just ends up being pictures of muscular men wearing kind of strange outfits, holding maybe some weird artifacts. There's not really anything that defines it as Mormon art, except that it's by this particular guy. And his intention was to promote me as the next Freiberg. I got a lot of white marble, white alabaster, started carving statues and painting pictures and all kinds of religious type of art. And the idea was that it would be advertised during BYU football and in some of the more elite Mormon commercial magazines. It all hinged on one thing: got to be a Mormon. And at that time, you know, I grew up with some people who were Mormons. I had read parts of the Book of Mormon. I had at that time been living in Las Vegas, where being Mormon is like being Catholic in Italy. It's kind of like that's a very it's not a cult religion there. In some places, Mormons are kind of on the outskirts of society. In Las Vegas, it was a very normal person kind of thing. We had black people, brown people, white people, yellow people, green people. Well, we didn't have too many green people, but yes, there was a very diverse crowd of people that we had, and it felt like a very natural progression for me to join the church. I found immediately on joining the church that it changed my outlook toward other people and associating with other people. And they would come to the bishopric and say, I need money for my family. And I'd be sitting here at this table with the bishop and deciding with him and with the other counselors is we're going to pay these people. We're going to help them. We're going to help them with their problems or not. And having some kind of influence over those people's lives or any of the other things that we did with the priestly stuff, it immediately became apparent that getting into this role as an actual clerical professional in a priestly role came with certain levels of participation that you didn't get just as regular congregant. That being involved in decision-making, positions of authority led to you actually having demonstrable power to either say this is going to happen or this is not going to happen. And whether it's to make that kind of decision for people and their families and whatever is one thing, but the magician is saying, I'm going to decide, are we going to have this or that in the universe or in the world? What we're doing with ourselves as a civilization is in some way decided by people who say, we're going to make this happen. And being in a position to actually be responsible for those things, I think, is important. Several times in the book, I go over this, that if you want to be important in a field, if you want to have authority in something, you have to actually be involved in it. And there's not really any authority if no one's asking your opinion, you don't get to give your opinion on it. And I remember talking to the miners in Tanzania and the people associated with them, and they're all like, look, they don't want money. You don't help anybody by sending money. They don't want your money, but if you want to come over here and help drive the food around, that's great. You can do that. You can join up and be the guy who drives the food around to all of the miners that the government gives out, because they did for 8 years before they find anything on average. So they got to support them in the meantime. They don't want people who aren't involved. They want people who are involved. So the responsibility level is like that. If you're conjuring for this whole grand order of life and you're not physically part of that, what right do you have to tell those people how their lives have to go?
It's a really great point. And I'm doing this from memory, so I'm probably butchering this, but in the book you mention an example of, I think it's water quality or water purity, and
yes,
if
Guatemalans,
yes. Yes. And can you share about that? It's like, if you don't have a direct role in improving the water quality or water purity in Guatemala, you might not have as much of a powerful result or involvement in achieving a result.
Right. And it's the same thing. If you want to conjure weather in Los Angeles, be in Los Angeles. If you're going to help people, you can't help them from afar. And I think that a lot of people now, they've got this idea that all you have to do is spend the money and the people will get the help. And that's not really true. Generally, the people who are spending the money are not monitoring where it goes. And I like to say you cannot spend $100 million responsibly. It is impossible. There's no one on this planet who responsibly spends $100 million. You can spend $10 very responsibly. Now, there's been times in my life where my entire weekly budget for everything I might need was like $50. I guarantee you that $50 was very well and carefully spent. But you start working with so much that you can't participate in what's going on, you're not getting anything out of it. Being able to be there and be hands-on, and if you want to say, look, the Guatemalans have a really difficult time getting water, and so no wonder they want to come to America, they want to come to Mexico, they want to get out of Guatemala because it's hard to live there. Well, that's understandable. So people say, well, they need to have the wells fixed so that they can drink the water. That's fine. Go there and fix them. Use your magic then to help those people while you're there. You can't just sit in a New York apartment and say, I'm going to conjure for these Guatemalans to have more water so they stop taking over the jobs in Texas or whatever. You're not involved. You got no dog in the fight. So that's where I'm at. If you're going to conjure for things, be bold enough to say, maybe this is a big deal, but with the magic, you can do it. You, as a normal person, you say, well, I want to change the way that hydrology in Guatemala works. You're going to have some difficulties there, even if you are on site. But you go down there with your magic wand and you say, aha, I'm going to conjure to make this happen. It's a whole different story. You start pulling in a whole different basket of resources to make that happen.
To that point about authority, John, and taking responsibility and direct involvement, we have a listener question from Sedger. And Sedger is asking, with regards to the vellum, which basically is the prepared skin of a killed animal, there seems to be little discussion as to, for me at least, Sedger says, the most important part of it, that vellum is a physical object of the dead and thus a sort of blood offering. Sedger says the goetic spirits are the spirits of the land, the underworld, and the dead, and as such, the use of an object from something dead would be crucial when evoking them. I'm curious as to John's opinion, Sedger says, on the importance of the vellum with regards to the idea of death and sacrifice, and also if it hasn't been underplayed somewhat in the modern grimoire tradition.
So the vellum, and by this I'm hoping I'm interpreting the question right, that it is the calfskin parchment or the vellum parchment with the hexagram of Solomon upon it, that when the spirit arrives, it is shown the seal and told by the seal that you will submit. The purpose of the seal in the ritual is to obtain comprehensible form of the spirit so that it becomes physical enough to where you can have some kind of meaningful interaction with it, as opposed to watching incense smoke go around the room and wondering what's going on. The idea of it being vellum as a connection to the dead and sacrifice and all that is a really fascinating idea. It's not something that I've really come across. I don't typically have a lot of interest in working with the dead, but to recognize that that's a huge part of magic and the necromantic art and all of that, it's absolutely there. There's probably quite a bit of good research that could be put into exactly why the calf skin is there and what it means. It might connect to the idea of the cow that's sacrificed to consecrate the temple in the time of the Messiah. It might have some other kind of deeper significance to the traditions behind, the seal of Solomon. I'm not familiar with what that is. What the tradition is. There's this vast rabbinical store of knowledge about what the different calfskins and sacrifices and all of that are, and I'm just not up to speed on all of that, but it is an interesting idea that connects in a much bigger way. As far as it being underplayed in the tradition and underused, people, again, this is kind of where we began on all this. People spend so much time trying to figure out what the XPUS means and what all these names are. It's less about that. It's less about the symbols that are on it. Basically, they're a mix of Roman, Christian, Greek, Jewish, all kinds of different mix of different theologies that go in. And then when the spirit makes any kind of move or presents itself in any way, you're kind of using a whole bucket of different spiritual sources of authority to say, by all of this stuff, you're supposed to be kind of what I want you to be. You're supposed to get the way that I want you to manifest so that I can interact with you, so that we can form something out of this. It's a very interesting connection there. I'm sure that there's more to it. I don't know too much more about what that connection might be.
You just made me think of, I know, a book that you are very familiar with, and Dr. Stephen Skinner, Black Easter, where there's a section in there where the black magician Theron Ware is being asked about that by someone else. Well, what does this symbol mean? And what does that symbol mean? And he simply says, it's probably degraded Hebrew. It's not the point, what does it mean? What matters is that they're there. What matters is that you use those symbols as part of the mutually agreed upon terms of the experiment itself.
To some extent, I agree with that, but I think that at some point you get into what some people would call superstition. That it's this idea that they're there just because they have to be there doesn't mean that if you're somehow able to 100% replicate them out of a copy of the grimoire, them being there is not important as much as having an idea of what them being there is for. when you present these symbols and you say, by these symbols you are to manifest and do these things because they mean something roughly connected to holy things, divine things, whatever. If you don't understand that they have that connotation, then it's still just representing a form exactly. It doesn't have any meaning and purpose behind it. And when presenting it to the spirit, the fact that it's there doesn't help you as much as the fact that it's means something. I like to think of it like when your kid presents you a crayon drawing of you and you don't look like you still know that they're trying to draw you. Or if they write your name wrong, then they still know that you're writing your name. You're looking at it like, okay, my kid is making a good attempt. The same with the spirits, with whatever is observing this. They catch the intention more than the specific thing. And I see a lot of people especially will take like Pentacles of Solomon and other seals and just transpose them 100% out of the text. So it's like, oh, I can tell even which published version this was drawn from because it's just a scan and copy. At least have the decency to redraw the lines and get into it and get an idea of something more than that, because it needs more than just remaking.
I am so glad you brought that up, John, and I knew that manually highlighting things in your book would come in handy, because on page 359, you mention that, quote, it is not enough to ask whether the circle in the Lemegeton's Goetia, is intended to protect the magician or fortify the magician's power. One must aim, you say, to grasp the bigger concepts which are represented in its design. And to that point, you spend many pages in the book going through each of the 10 names of God. You say that each magician may have individual meaning for the names, and the meaning is individual, but it's important to just know where these names come from and the implication behind the names.
In calling upon all of these angels, archangels, divine names, you're going to get different perspectives on what they mean exactly. I went over an argument recently. I get into way too many arguments on the internet, and it's about Archangel Michael. Now, Archangel Michael has many different interpretations over the ages. If you ask a religious Jewish person of one variety, one thing, they might say he stands up to defend Israel on the Day of Atonement. You might ask somebody else, and they have much more esoteric point of view. The Christians have one thing, the Seventh-day Adventists have their version, the Mormons have their version. They all disagree as to the precise nature of the archangel, and yet they all invoke it. They all say this is a holy angel. No one will say, oh, no, it's actually evil demon stuff. They're mostly in agreement that Michael Archangel has a certain kind of elevated status. That's enough. It's enough for them to do that. They don't have to go and prove the Catholics wrong just to fortify their Seventh-day Adventist view or their Mormon view or whatever. It's not about having the view that's indisputably correct. It's about having the one that works for you, that makes sense, that you can get into. And I think the biggest problem, I get people especially that come from, say, less Christian backgrounds or Nordic people who are completely unfamiliar with Judaism altogether, and they're looking at these things and they say, this is a bunch of Jewish stuff, I don't understand any of it. It's kind of Jewish stuff. It's really Jewish stuff that's been heavily worked over by Christians and plenty of other people along the way, and it's not really Judaism. It seems like it. It sounds like it. It's definitely 25 pages of God talk there, but that's because I'm trying to interpret what these people mean by including all of these names and what they do. And it's definitely a lot more than looking at them as just a catalog of names and saying, what sphere they relate to, but trying to interpret what philosophical processes, what things that you can actually get into as you're going around the circle, calling upon these names and creating the circle. And by the way that I do this is to walk around, and each step is a different name. Generally speaking, you step and you go really slow, go all the way around, do 3 times around, and then finally back into the circle. And at that point, it doesn't matter what you think the names are. The impression that you'll get, I compare it to being on the ferry. I used to live on an island. You go on the ferry, and as soon as I get on the ferry and past that Welcome Back to America sign, I know that nothing that happens on the land matters to me anymore. It doesn't matter what's going to happen over there. I'm on this boat. I'm going to be on this boat until I get where it's going, unless something really bad happens. And that same feeling of like, yep, there's the land, bye-bye land, I'm going somewhere else. That's the feeling that you ought to get when you get into the circle, regardless of whatever you think the names mean. It should ultimately just put you at that point where you, having fortified yourself with all of these names, you now realize where you stand as a magician. If you're in relation to the wheels of existence and the fires of the spirit and all of the different names and all of these elements of the magical cosmology that you've just walked through and intoned the names of, you're now surrounded by all of that. It should give you a perspective of being essentially separated from your normal life.
You've touched a lot extensively in your previous writings and also in the Faculty of Abrac on Mormonism and the importance of the connection with the Faculty of Abrac to Mormonism. This is obviously a huge subject, but if you could just give the listeners the broad strokes, perhaps, about the connection between the history of Mormonism and the occult, and Joseph Smith and the occult. I think some people might know bits and pieces, but what are some of the key broad strokes that you just like to leave listeners with about this specific topic?
First off, I'd like to say that I essentially believe the Mormon doctrine, and not on all points, but if I were to qualify myself in any particular religion, it's certainly more that than Scientology or Catholicism or something like that. And it's not something that I grew up with. It's something that, after being involved in the magic, I saw so much magical themes in Mormonism, and it's unlike Thelema or Wicca or any of the other Satanism or anything like that that might have good points to make. Getting involved in something that's very mainstream and conventional like Mormonism, it allows me to promote that, to be a part of it, to stump for it, even when it's weird. You get a very different reaction when you say, oh yeah, I'm a Mormon, than when you say I'm Asatru. It's a whole different presence for what you get. And so for me, it's like a lot of their doctrines were really hard to swallow. A lot of it was just really weird stuff. You have to spend some time with it and realize that Mormonism is a very large system of stuff. Everybody's seen the South Park. They all know that. It's weird to me, too, because when you bring up Mormonism, the very first thing even very intelligent, well-socialized people will do is they make fun of it one way or another. It's all, the many wives and the magic underwear. If you think magic underwear and looking into your hat for revelations are a bad thing, you need to throw out all of your occult books right now. Because what is magic underwear? Why don't the magicians think that this is a normal thing? So I saw a lot more of magic, of my own interpretation of magic in Mormonism. And then, of course, you get into Mormonism and you talk to the people, and they hate that. Some of them, individually, you find the people who study it and they're like, this stuff is really fascinating. But most of them don't like it. That's where there's a Netflix production that's coming up about the Salamander letter, which is the letter that the church insists is a forgery that indicates that Joseph Smith was seeking treasure by magical conjurations as opposed to seeking prophecies through prayer. It's quite a consternation for the church that they've got, the Joseph Smith talisman also. It's a Jupiter talisman from Francis Barrett. They insist that has nothing to do with him. Basically, anywhere that occultism props up, the Mormon church is very keen on saying, nope, that's not our thing. So it's hard to see Mormonism itself as an occult religion. But then when you look at what they're doing, the same as we talked about last time, their version of it is to have blessings and revelations and prayer. There's no symbols, there's no occultism, there's no demons and genies. It's just you and the Lord and your understanding. And it's a different kind of occult because there's not a symbolic level of occultism. There is symbolism in Mormonism, and especially in the temple rituals, but it's very hard to see as symbolism. It's something where whoever it was that was involved in putting it together said, we're not going to make this symbolic looking. I think ultimately it comes together because the Mormon story is so full of fantasy and magical reality. The idea of the spirit apparitions, the golden tablets, the magic sword, and all of that stuff, the tomb that everybody had to walk in. There's lots of elements of that And maybe you could say that comes out of the Memphis Mizraim rite of Masonry, the clandestine Masonry that was really kind of getting big at that time. Other things like old early Christian doctrines that appear in Mormonism, like the baptism of the dead was something that was done until about the time of St. Benedict. That was something that was part of Christianity, but the sects of Christianity that practiced that are now gone. They're just not with us. Gnosticism. Everybody loves to say Mormons have lots of Gnostic doctrines because of their position on women and things like that. Well, they don't call it that. They don't treat it like that. To them, that's just part of the doctrine. And I find that it's admirable how seamlessly they work those doctrines into their ordinary thing. And to me, it's magic. I'm just seeing Francis Barrett and Westcott and all of that stuff just repeated in Mormon Doctrine and Covenants. You can read it. It's all there. They talk about that stuff. We actually had classes in the Ward about, how to consecrate our magic oil for doing healings and stuff. So they're very much into a lot of the practices and ideas of magic, but they don't want to call it that.
As you mentioned, the history of Mormonism and Joseph Smith and receiving angelic revelation and decoding a message or using stones in order to engage with spiritual entities. I mean, one could be thinking that they're talking about one of the grimoires that so many people are familiar with. Like, those fingerprints are there all over the place.
I have a weird theory of the origins of Mormonism that the church absolutely hates. And I used to be a gospel doctrine teacher. I'm fairly familiar with Mormon church history and their interpretations of the scriptures and stuff. And I got to say that this is not in them, but this is just my personal interpretation as to what makes sense. And people who are familiar with the Mormon story probably enjoy this. So all throughout New York and Connecticut, up in that area, there's, I think, like 60 of them, different stone chamber rooms that were built by God knows who. That they may be Neolithic, they might have been built by Nordic people who'd come over. People still say it was the Phoenicians. There's all kinds of interpretations of where this Ohio Valley culture came from. It just spread out through the entire north and northeastern United States. And one of these little holes in the side of a hill that leads into a chamber sounds a heck of a lot like the Mormon origins story where he says, I discovered the golden tablets and the sword of Laban and the Liahona compass and all of these artifacts that are found in this place. It sounds very much like one of these sanctuaries that are fairly common in the area. Although, as far as I know, they're not at the hill Cumorah, where he said that he actually found the stuff. The story is that he's out in the forest praying, he sees the two figures, then this angel comes to him in the night, he leads him off to the tablets and shows him all of this stuff. Well, Joseph Smith's maternal grandfather was a famous well diviner in his area. He'd find water. He went around, he had a feng shui compass, he had a German hunting sword, which is kind of like a one-bladed sword that it has a particular look to it. You can look up what a German hunting sword looks like. It's not like a regular sword. It's got kind of its own shape to it. You're meant to basically have your hounds hold down a pig, and then you go up and you stab the pig. So it's a short sword that's really strong to be stabbing into things, and it basically looks like a giant steak knife. So he had a hunting sword, and he had a seer stone. Well, no one knows what this was, some kind of geode crystal. I've seen pictures of things that are supposed to have been it, but I don't give credence to any of those. So my interpretation of this is that he and perhaps someone else had a sect of some kind in which they practiced rituals, probably using these stone chambers, and that he decided to initiate Joseph Smith into this sect. And Joseph Smith, not wanting to really get too involved in it because he was still a very religious person. He studied a lot of the older scriptures and things, and I think he didn't want to necessarily perpetuate the sect, but ended up taking some of those ideas and forming his own. He finds this cache of artifacts. It happens to be artifacts that match exactly to those that his grandfather had carried around, and then he comes back to us all with this hereditary priesthood concept. The golden tablets or golden plates that he mentions, there's lots of descriptions about these, about the kind of oxidization that they had on them, how the pages were sealed together, the sound of what the gold pages made when they're flipped like a book, because they're very, very thin. And you could flip them and then it would make this musical kind of sound. As a person who's worked with tons and tons of gold sheets that are very, very thin, I've seen all of these things. A person in the 1830s, unfamiliar with lots of gold, would probably not have been able to just invent this if they hadn't actually seen it. So I'm perfectly willing to believe that the golden plates and those artifacts are real, but maybe their interpretation is fudged a little bit to make it more palatable. And now the Mormon Church wants to backtrack on all of it, shove it under the rug, and pretend that none of that really existed. The basic idea of the Book of Mormon is that it is a rhetoric. It's presented as a story, but all of the stories amount to different strategies for sharing the gospel with people. So when people want to talk about, oh, it's not true, or it's not real, or whatever, it's meant as a suggestive method for approaching people who are reluctant to hear the gospel and getting them kind of in the idea of hearing it. I think Joseph Smith adapted Memphis Mizraim right, Kabbalistic teachings, theosophy, whatever he could get his hands on. Obviously not theosophy, but the same doctrines that ultimately became theosophy. These ideas of alchemy and the early Christian beliefs that were weird, and those all became Christianity. Well, those same things, the Enoch scriptures, the War of the Sons of Light and Darkness, all of those scriptures, they also became occultism. Occultism and Mormonism have the same roots. And so, of course, when I see Mormonism, all I'm seeing is a much different development of some of these same ideas. Some of the same root concepts that's in grimoires, Enochian magic, all of that, the same stuff ended up becoming Mormonism, just on a slightly different path.
We do, John, have a listener question from Angelo Rossini, who is asking, quote, does John see within the next 10 years himself and a new group of magicians rising up and taking grimoire magic further than the older, more fundamental technical grimoire manuals into a more vision-centered field, focusing on how to create or co-create a more rewarding and prosperous future for us and mankind? Angelo says basically how to go further behind the veil and internal workings to co-create something grander for your life.
Well, first off, I'm going to say that this is probably, at least for the foreseeable future, the last occult book that I'll be writing for a good long while. I've said what I've got to say. I'm not really looking to establish anything with occult groups or people or whatever. The book is very clear about this as well, that it's really something that you're going to learn on a fairly individual basis or with a small group of people who are very close to you. All the people who I associate directly with in magic, I talk to once or twice a week and have for this whole time. They're not just order members or something. That doesn't exist. Either I'm talking to a person every other day on the phone, or I'm not involved with them. And I think that that's just a stronger, better way of dealing with people. So as far as, creating a movement or something like that, I'm not really. I'm looking more, instead of rising up, I like to say to burrow, to find a hole that's good for me, and then to burrow into that, whether that's, my industry is the jewelry industry, and what I'm doing with the jewelry industry and connecting with the people in the jewelry industry who want to share some of my goals. If somebody else has goals and things that they want to rise up with, absolutely go and do that. And find the ways to get into the places that you want to get into. And then if you're good at getting in those places, then what you want will become what they do. So if you want to see better video games, get involved in video games. If you want to see better literature, do that. Whatever. I'd like to say roofing and plumbing. If you want to get involved in that and change, who gets a roof over their head, for example, or those Guatemalans with the tin roofs, and you really want to get into that, go do that. And, rise up that way, as opposed to getting everybody together on an identity bandwagon and then, trying to promote that.
We do also, John, have a listener question from Sean, who is asking, other magicians like Julio Cesar Ode, Frater Ashen Chassan, and Stephen Skinner talk about repeating conjurations, sometimes for hours, until the spirit arrives. John's blog, Sean says, reads as if this rarely happens. Do you, John, experience the need to repeat conjurations for extended periods of time?
On a couple of occasions, yes. Mostly, no. I've thought about this as well, because when you look at traditional exorcisms, and they're going to last days, maybe weeks at sometimes, there's really an intensive process. And I think a big part of this that's not really being seen is that the ceremony happens at the end. That when you're done with your prep work, you really want to consider what you're doing, you want to lay it all out, get ready and spend at least a few days getting yourself ready for what you're doing. And doing that kind of thing is going to cut down on how much time you have to sit there and retool yourself to get into a different kind of mindset about things. If you're, I'm going to make dinner and then I'm going to go conjure spirits, it's not going to work out too well. You give yourself at least a day or two of just sitting down and focusing on only the conjuration and what you're going to do with it, and trying not to, I don't mean in total isolation kind of thing, but just really focusing on that. And maybe that's been something that's had effect on it, but I think it does. I think that's the main thing, is to do your prep work beforehand, and it's going to save you time chanting over and over again. The other thing is, like, if I'm not really thinking correctly about, if I am distracted, or that's always been something that's stalled it up in some way. The other thing that's messed it up is physical interference, noise, airplanes, helicopters going overhead, being near people that are going to physically interact with you, whether it's hikers and their dog, or I've had all that stuff. Just stay away from that, because you wonder what's going on. Oh, it's the NSA tracking me. I guess I've got to turn them off, and then we'll get to it. So find ways to isolate yourself from surveillance, from interference, from all of that, and get into your own space.
In terms of identifying challenges and working to overcome them, John, that leads to another listener question we have from Damien, and this has to do with challenges with scrying. Damien says, I'm curious about John's work with the Almadel. How did the angels appear to you, John? Damien's asking, did you, John, see and hear them directly, or was the communication somewhat different for you? And what were the effects of working the Almadel for you?
Ultimately, the effect of it was that I was able to swallow my pride well enough to get in contact with people that brought me into the Mormon Church, and realizing that I should be more charitable and more forgiving and just generally a different kind of person. And those sentiments are kind of the main thing that I got out of all of it. It was several months of just going over and over these themes of what am I going to do. I ended up starting out the first cycle of the Almadel. I had pretty much whatever I wanted. I was pretty happy about just the amount of stuff that I had. I had money, I had comfort, and by the end of it, I had pretty much nothing. And then getting out of it and rechanging it, I completely renovated the whole thing. It was like I took my whole life circumstances apart and then had to piece them back together with the sense of being more charitable, more open-minded, just generally on a different moral plane of things. And I found that when conjuring demons, especially these dysfunctions of the human species, that relating to those from a position of now I've fixed myself a little better, that being charitable actually does make a difference to people, being kind to people actually does make a difference, and being able to rearrange how I approached life in general was a really big effect for me. As far as you mean about like the lights, sounds, all of that kind of thing, the physical manifestation of the spirit, I can't say that I've done any kind of scrying, or really that I even believe that the Almadel experience involves scrying really of any kind. The idea is that the reflection of the candles in this closed environment provides an interference pattern coming off of the highly polished triangle. This lights from the candles, and the smoke, and all of that, it's producing just a concentrated region that's only identifiable as light and smell. There's a vague notion that there might be something there. And then you're getting these thoughts of, I really dislike this aspect of myself. I really wish that I had this aspect instead. There's a reason for that. And then being able to sit down, you're there for an hour. The Almadel experience, if you're not doing it for as long as you would be at church, then you're doing it wrong. You should, after the conjuration, still be sitting there and experiencing that and going through it. You've only performed the liturgy of the word. There's still the Eucharist that you need to go through. And it's something that you have to give it that time and allow the spirits to be able to do that, the same as you've got to put up with the old priest giving the homily. It's something that you've got to still embrace what's going on. But no, even in the absence of physical, visual imagery. And that's why I present it the way I do, because I think a person should begin with this without strong visual imagery, without pictures of angels, without sounds and voices, just being able to relate to it as it's me, my moral compass, and then this attunement of the moral compass that's over here in the closet with stuff hanging on it.
And speaking of these different layers or different levels of experiences, John, we also have another listener question from Damien, who says, I could totally be wrong about this, but Damien says, I think I remember John saying on a now defunct forum how he had conjured the 4 cardinal kings of the Goetia, and the experience was life-changing. Would John be willing to speak more about this?
So, unwillingly, I'm not sure that I actually said that on a now defunct forum. I might have, or I might have said something like that. But yeah, it's true. So, I had this idea that I was going to conjure the 4 great kings. I initially approached this through the lens of the Book of Oberon. In the Book of Oberon, the 4 great kings, they are not just addressed as their own names, but with these other names that go with them, and it's this very curious presentation of it. And my intention in conjuring them was, maybe it was foolhardy, but to become exempt from whatever it was that they were doing, and to restructure all of what I was doing according to a new path of doing things. And that sounds great on paper, where you go, okay, I'm going to no longer be subject to the will of the demon kings, and I'm going to be free to make my own destiny. I was like, okay, I've conjured for having my great house. I'm fortified here on my hilltop on my island. I've got my jewelry store. I'm doing great. And I conjured these spirits. It was twice, actually. I called it with one of my friends. And one of them was out in the forest on the island, and the other was on my hilltop, kind of behind my house, where I had just ancient standing stones set up around the top, and you get to look out over the whole island. It was kind of a cool place to be. So the first one, it started snowing. We had to leave, and we thought, okay, this is not really what we wanted. It felt weird. Let's regroup and go and redo the whole thing back at the house on top of the hill, where we don't feel like we're standing out in the woods. I think actually on Google Earth you can still see the circle made out in the wilderness out there. It's still there. But it was a circle that, because it was made in the woods, it was made out of pine cones and sticks and dragged stuff in the ground, and it wasn't exactly like what it needed to be. So it's like, okay, let's go back to where we've got more stable stuff. After that ceremony, I'll get to what it did for me, but just for what it did in general, out in that place where we had drawn the first circle with the pine cones and stuff, a bunch of sheep got killed. Farmer said that the sheep were killed by a pack of wild dogs or wolves. He wasn't sure which. We never found any indication that there actually were wild dogs. This is an island that's 3 miles across. If there were packs of wild dogs running around, people would know. There were no dogs. There were no wolves. The sheep were ripped to shreds. I don't know what kind of wolf or dog ripped sheep to shreds, but that's what happened. It became a big scandal in the news that would have been a bigger scandal if it hadn't been for the worst act of vandalism in the history of the town happened on that same night. It was after midnight during a blizzard, because the ceremony we did was around midnight, and then it must have been after that in just blinding snow, and whoever did it got up there onto that hill, which is in my neighborhood. They would have had to have gotten up there somehow. They piled up an enormous pile of pornography and set it all on fire right in the middle of where the circle was. And after that, they puked, they pooped themselves, and then they went down to town and desecrated every single church in town and destroyed a bunch of personal property, garage doors, windows, mailboxes, just wrecked the whole town from that spot all the way across town. The only church that didn't have something happen, I think it was the Jehovah's Witnesses. I think their Kingdom Hall was the only one that was not actually, because it didn't look like a church. But all the rest of them got desecrated, even the old one. And people said, well, maybe it was kids. They put out a big reward for it. But seriously, who lets their kids out after midnight in the snow? And if you hear your windows breaking, your garage door being destroyed, your mailbox being smashed and it's going up and down the street, wouldn't at some point someone have known? This is a small town. You can't so much as sneer at somebody without everybody knowing your business. But somehow all of this could go on. I never found out. My theory on this, and this is not a very popular theory, is that someone was what you might call demon possessed. That a person, maybe some drunk on the hillside, I don't know, some person, not a spiritual entity, had been mentally or emotionally disturbed to a point where they went and did all of this and somehow got away with it without anybody even noticing in the cold quiet of night. Just a really bizarre thing. And if that wasn't weird enough, my entire life after that, very, very shortly after that, went to absolute crap. And I'd rather not get into the details of it, but I'll end up with saying that pretty much everything I ever have owned or ever made or ever did was destroyed completely. I lost my family, my children, my house. I ended up living in this condemned building in Memphis, 1,000 miles away, with no roof. I had to divert the rainwater into the toilet to make it work at one point. I had to walk. I had got this ridiculously awful job 3 walking miles away. That was the time when my budget was $50 a week. It was just ridiculously bad. And, over the last couple of years, 5-6 years now, I've picked myself back up and I'm doing fine. But the coming home to roost of everything bad that I had ever done was like everything that all of my evil karma that I ever had happened to pile into like a very short period of my life and just dump itself on me so that I was made to regret everything that was possibly regrettable. And I can't but think that it's having to do with these spirits. And by the way, the reception from the kings was the flat out, "You are nothing, we are going to ruin you." It was a very clear description of exactly what was going on. I was not happy with the result of the ritual. So if you're going to, it's mentioned in the book about dealing with these 4 great kings, that disaster surrounds them. And if you're going to approach them and you feel like you're just too cool, you're going to get in trouble. And so that's kind of, my experience of the 4 great kings. Life-changing, not necessarily in a great way.
Really appreciate you sharing that, John. And it's almost hard to even follow you sharing something like that. But we do have another listener question from Damien, who is asking, lastly, John, do you still plan to publish the full account of all 72 evocations at some point?
I didn't bring it to show you here, but I've got these little zines that I like to make. I love to make little zines, and most of these accounts, they're just one-offs for a zine. And I've got my illustrations, and if you've gotten the Great Key, the illustrations of the spirits that are in the Great Key are a miniature scaled down kind of sketch version of what's in this other stuff. When I actually write it, it's this giant red book like this with a big Mars symbol on the front, and it's absolutely stuffed with like 400 pages of extra pages into the 400 pages of what it is. And all of that is actually my notes. That's what I stand there in the circle and actually write on, is with these. And then I'll retranslate that into an actual book. And so what I've got for the spirits is each one has like a little bit of a zine that's 6 to 7 pages. It talks about what the interaction was and whatnot. And I don't know if I'm going to release that at some point or not. But as far as occult publications for at least the next 5 years, maybe 10, maybe forever, I'm pretty much done. I don't have any need to reach a new audience. I don't care if people read the stuff. I don't really care if it's successful as a book. I just write it because I like to write it, and maybe someday people will say, okay, this guy also had some thoughts on it that deserve to be presented along with the rest of the body of literature. I'm not really trying to promote this as being the next big thing or anything like that.
It strikes me that, writing for you is like your artwork, like your crafting of stories and art, and your writing just comes from a very deep personal place that is based on your direct experience with the spirits, and these things are kind of tied together.
Yeah, and I also am writing short stories. I write fiction. I take incidents from my life and add in explosives and then make them cooler. Yeah, it's fun. I like writing. None of my writing in fiction has anything at all to do with the occult. there's none of it. There's a few things in it, like a story about some Native Americans who see a giant fish wash ashore and make theories about what kinds of fish it might be or what it is. There's things about, my experience with attending a Juneteenth event, things like that. There's just no occultism in it. And I like writing that kind of stuff. Maybe I'll publish that someday, but make a few more of them first.
John, speaking of publishing, we have a listener question for you from Aaron Maybank. And Aaron Maybank is asking, can you ask Mr. King about his plans to publish the Book of Giants mentioned in his first interview?
I would love to say yes, but I got this idea that my version of the Book of Giants would be an illustrated version, and I pretty much decided to work on it when I'm traveling. So if I'm on the train, on a plane, something like that, I'm sketching it, and people are like, oh, Moses, or whatever, they're looking at it. I don't work on it as much as I ought to. If somebody wants to say, oh, I'd love to publish your version of the Book of Giants, and here's an advance on it, then yeah, you get it in a couple of weeks. But if otherwise, just left to my own devices, it's something you're going to have to fish out of my estate. If you have a particular, I'm sure you'll add my email or something, I'll be happy to send you scans and whatnot of what I got on it.
John, to that point, can you share about your upcoming or current projects or writings or art or anything that you can share with listeners that they should keep their ear to the ground on?
I've got this art that I like to produce, just paintings of fantasy art, Vikings, weird stuff. I like to do that. And I had this idea right before the pandemic. I said, I'm going to go into business with this stuff. I'm going to put up a website and I'll sell my art online. So valhallaprints.com was my art website. I haven't got it live yet, but it's got a few things. And it's really just very much like Lulu. I paint it, I upload it. Somebody wants to buy a canvas, high quality print of it. They're good high quality photos of the pictures. They're big, they're cool, and you print it and you buy it. And it's just a art for sale kind of site. I still work in the jewelry industry, so most of my artistry is going into that. I have kind of a run-of-the-mill sort of job where I do repairs, custom work. It's nothing fancy, but I connect to other people who have fancier stuff, and I work with them on either selling it, distributing it, designing it, whatever. So I still work in jewelry, but I, on purpose, keep that stuff pretty far away from the magic stuff, or else inevitably people will call the store and want demon stuff. It's a guaranteed that it's happened before. I don't like it happening, so I keep my jewelry pretty far away from the occult people.
What are the 2 or 3 biggest things that you want magicians or even readers just picking it up to read it to keep in mind? What should they be keeping in mind as they go through the 450 plus pages of the Faculty of Abrac?
Well, the first thing is that this is just my interpretation of things. That this is not me teaching you something that you might have learned elsewhere. If you're a student who wants to learn about magic, be sure you get some other books too, because you're going to really have a hard time getting grounding just from this. This is a commentary on existing books. And by the same token, people who do know what they're talking about, they've got to leave a bit of their prejudices at the door. If you've got a vision of exactly what magic ought to include or not include, I guarantee you're going to get annoyed at somewhere in reading this book. It's designed to force people to look in new directions, even if those might seem silly at first. It's really about exploring how big of a subject magic really is or could be, and looking at it from not just as Solomonic or as modern or ancient or any of that, but to look at it as a whole picture of magic and magicians that just happens to dance around this concept of Solomon. It could just as well be some other figure.
And also a very important point to stress is that if people are looking to get a copy, you only sell them on Lulu, correct? That is the place they should go.
Yes, that is true. I used to sell on Amazon, and Amazon made it so that I didn't get any royalties for it, and I didn't really enjoy that. So instead of raising the prices so that I can make royalties, I just drop the prices and I sell them only on Lulu. So yes, go to search my name out on Lulu, and that's how you find it. And I'm sorry that they charge so much in shipping, and it'll take 3 weeks to get to you, but that's just the way it is.
I think listeners will be grateful no matter how long it takes to arrive. And is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners?
really, I think that you'll be entertained by the book. That's the biggest thing. It's not really meant to be educating. It's not really just meant to be my ranting. It's supposed to be entertaining. It should be something that you can read it, even if you're not an occultist. And it kind of is tongue-in-cheek said that if your wife thinks you're crazy, give it to her and let her understand a little bit about what you're into. And it might not be a precise definition, but it's something that people who are not magicians can appreciate, that we're maybe not as crazy as it seems.
In fact, I'm taking this totally out of context. I believe, to speak to the humor, one of the lines in the book is, quote, "Sometimes lava happens," and I'm just going to leave it at that. Author, artist, jeweler, goldsmith, experienced ceremonial magician, John R. King IV. John, thank you, as always, for taking the time and sharing your wisdom today on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for giving me the time. I do appreciate that, too.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed the chat with John R. King as much as I did. I find John's book, The Faculty of Abrac, and our chat here as a reminder for all of us, I know for myself for sure, to always ask, why do we practice magic? What is the big picture? Why should we value the end goals and benefits of magic over mapping out exactly which spirit fits where and putting everything into neat little boxes? I love doing magical research, for sure, and I love connecting the dots and comparing different manuscripts from hundreds of years ago. It's all so amazing, but I also find that John's thoughts are a wonderful and rejuvenating reminder on the practical side of the importance of stepping into the role of the magician with sincerity and a full heart. And as always, your wonderful Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions were so fantastic. Thanks so much to each and every one of you for your support on patreon.com/glitchbottle. It keeps the esoteric engines running, and it takes the show in new and interesting directions. You can always subscribe to Glitch Bottle as well on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.